Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It is May 29th, 2023, and we are here in part two of an epic, what we think is going to be three-part series with former Mormon Bishop Bill Reel, podcaster Bill Reel, and generally good guy and Mormon influencer. He's now a YouTuber. And you can find Bill Reel on Mormonism Live at present every Wednesday night at 6:20 p.m. Utah or Mountain Time on YouTube. But you can also check out Mormon Discussion Podcast and a rich archive there, especially if you're a believing Mormon. Mormon Discussion Podcast, at least the first half to two-thirds are all going to be super helpful. But Bill also has a network of podcasts on the Mormon Discussion Network, which we could talk about a little bit later. But we're now in part two. In part one, we had Margie and Amanda Reel, Bill's wife, here with us to talk about the making of Bishop Bill Reel. And we encourage you, if you haven't watched that yet, to consider pausing, going back and watching part one, because today, part two, we're going to build on part one. But we left off last episode with Bill requesting to be released as a Mormon bishop. He was called at the fresh young age of 29 to be a Mormon bishop. He came on Mormon Stories as an active, believing bishop. He started a podcast called Mormon Discussion as a believing Mormon bishop. But he started to have some concerns about the sincerity and or ethics of top Mormon Church leadership and leadership at the stake level, and started to feel a lot of empathy for people who are struggling in the church, and most importantly, wanted the church to be honest and open and create an environment in the church where people doubting and questioning could feel safe and comfortable. And so we left off at the end of part one with Bill requesting to be released as a bishop, and with, I don't know exactly when Fair Mormon and you, Bill, sort of parted ways. Was that while you were still a bishop, or was that after your release?
Yeah, that would have been back in Ohio. So that would have been sometime in 2014, and I don't move to southern Utah until the end of 14.
Okay. So, and also the Gospel Topics essays came into your time as bishop, et cetera. So for part two of this episode, it's going to be, I think we're kind of titling it, the unraveling of Bishop Bill Reel, or the deconstruction of Bishop Bill Reel. But we're basically going to be talking about how Bill Reel goes from faithful, active, devout Mormon bishop, having been a convert, having been a Mormon for the ages in Sandusky, Ohio, for at least 10 to 15 years. Yeah. And then what happened? How does someone who's a faithful, devout bishop and who's a podcaster with the intent of keeping people in the Mormon Church, of helping them find that middle way, what went wrong, and how did he end up not only losing his Orthodox faith, but actually get excommunicated? So this part two, we're going to pick up with you no longer being bishop, and we're going to end this part two with your excommunication and talk about, would you say your decline or your rise? Which one?
I think it's all been an incredibly fun journey. And I know certain people would like to put some of those labels on it, but it's been just a fun time to kind of learn who I was.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's pick up where we left off. You get released as bishop.
Yeah.
You're podcasting, you're interviewing a lot of the big names in faithful Mormonism. Patrick Mason, Thomas McConkie, Richard Bushman, Terrell Givens, all those big names that you started to become introduced to on Mormon Stories podcast. By 2014, Kate Kelly and I, you mentioned in our email correspondence how much you loved Denver Snuffer and enjoyed my interview with him. Denver Snuffer gets excommunicated in 2013. Then in 2014, Kate Kelly's excommunicated. And then in 2015, February of 2015, I'm excommunicated. Talk about, like, as you had already started your podcast, as we discussed last episode, to kind of take over the place that I had somewhat abdicated, not necessarily intentionally, but just the way it happened. Tell me how you're processing that 2014, 2015 time period where you've kind of taken over as the faithful but honest Mormon-themed podcaster.
Yeah. We probably need to back up just a little bit, because while I was serving as a bishop, we talked last episode about there being kind of a time period where I'm having doubts, but I'm not really telling anybody. I'm not telling my wife. I'm not telling the counselors in the bishopric. I'm not really informing anybody. And two things happened. One is that there was a member of our ward who saw me being honest to the data as the bishop and came to me privately and said, I don't believe this thing, and you appear to be safe to talk to. And so he said, my marriage is at risk because my wife is all in, and as we sit and have a conversation around me not believing the church is true, I fear that she'll end up leaving me. And so he saw me as being very nuanced and helpful to him. But at the same time, while I'm not really sharing with anybody that I'm struggling, I end up writing Elder Holland. And
tell our Never Mormon viewers and listeners who Elder Holland is.
Yeah, so Jeffrey R. Holland is a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. He's been there for a long time. He's a very charismatic speaker in the church. People tend to look to him as being one of the folks who gives the better talks in the church. Elder Holland, for a while, was giving talks that seemed to be very soft and sensitive to people who had questions. And while I was a sitting bishop, I thought, well, if I'm beginning to have doubts, I guess I could reach out to these guys and maybe they'll help and maybe they won't, but that'll tell me something about who they are. And so I wrote Elder Holland telling him that I was having a faith crisis.
Okay, now you were still a bishop at this time.
Yeah.
And how did you get his email address? And what made you think he would respond? Because traditionally, Mormons can't just talk to apostles, right?
Right. But as a sitting bishop, you sort of can.
You had leverage, you think, because maybe he was worried if a bishop goes rogue and tells the world he doesn't believe anymore. I'm just making this up.
Yeah,
that he
I'd only be guessing. I have no idea. I wrote him. I figured out that all of the general authorities, if you put, I think it's their last name, first letter of first name, first letter of middle name at whatever it was, ldschurch.org, whatever it was, that the email would go through. And so I wrote him an email, and he ended up giving a card to Marlin K. Jensen, who was the church historian, and asked Marlin Jensen, I have that card in my possession. It was a card that said, Brother Jensen, please contact dear Bishop Reel. He seems to be having some questions and difficulties, and I think you're the best one to reach out to him and address that. Sincerely, you know, Jeff Holland. And so Marlin Jensen ended up reaching out to me, called me on my drive home one day from work.
How's that feel?
It felt like they were taking this bishop who's having a faith crisis seriously. And so Marlin and I talked for probably 45 minutes, and I ran him through 2, 3, 4 of the problems.
What do you guess those were at the time, if you just had to guess?
Book of Abraham, why we were taught a certain view of the translation method, hence that being connected to Joseph Smith's treasure digging, polygamy for sure. And as I brought up two or three...
Book of Mormon, Book of Abraham, polygamy might have been your top 3.
Yeah. And maybe race in the priesthood, because each of those can be used to kind of cover a higher point, right? Like race in the priesthood has to do with the prophetic mantle, and polygamy has to do with Joseph Smith's integrity, and the Book of Mormon has to do with whether the restoration even starts off on the right foot or not, and Joseph Smith's treasure digging has to do with whether guardian spirits with gold treasures buried in hills found by rocks is the same story as a guardian spirit named Moroni who has a buried set of plates in a hill that still involves a seer stone. And And that overlap seems coincidentally too close, doesn't it? And so Marlin talked to me, but what Brother Jensen essentially said is, I don't have any good answers to your questions. Your
Really?
questions.
He didn't even try?
Yeah, no. Just that we need to have faith, wait till the other side. We'll figure it out then. And I began to sense that answers like just have faith and wait till we get to the other side is what Jonathan Streeter would call a wood tool. They're meant to appease you as you have questions, keep you in the faith that you're in, but they work within any faith. In other words, if you give the same sorts of response to a Jehovah's Witness or a Scientologist, it helps them to stay in Scientology and stay in the Jehovah's Witness faith. So they're not real tools to figure out whether the church is true or not.
I'm kind of surprised because, by the time you're talking to Jensen, this is in his final years as church historian. He's a general authority. He would have been the one who led the Gospel Topics essays in their creation. He would know, he would have access to all the vaults. Like if anybody in the world had answers, it would be Marlin Jensen. So for him to just kind of say, have faith, I don't know. I think I would have experienced that as being quite disappointing.
It was. But the other side of the coin was it was also validating, right? The church historian is telling you over the phone that your concerns are valid, that these are real questions, that lots of people are struggling with them right now. And so that sort of part of the conversation felt like empathy, felt like taking my concerns seriously.
And they're also reaching out to the one, right? By reaching out to you.
Right. And the conversation was fine. When it ended, I was grateful to have had it, but I also realized if he doesn't have answers, then probably nobody does. And then maybe a month or two later, Elder Holland called me while I was at work. It was his secretary. Actually, I think her name was Lisa. And Lisa said, "Hey, I've got Jeff Holland on the line. He would like to talk to you. I'm over
Just
at the
out
church."
Of the blue?
Yeah. I pick up the phone and yeah, that's the situation. So I said, "Well, I'm at work. Can you give me just 2 minutes? I need to let my boss know, and I'm going to go off to a side room, and I'll take this call." And so I did that, went off to the side room. She patched me through to Elder Holland, and him and I talked for probably about 45 minutes.
What was that like?
Again, validating. Here's an apostle talking to me on the phone and acknowledging that my questions are real, that these are valid questions, that a statement he made that I remember is that the church is true, warts and all. And what Elder Holland communicated to me was that they were in the middle of working on these gospel topic essays. And the way and he didn't say the essays, but what he said was like, we're working on some papers, we're working on some online documents. And the way it's going to work is that it's going to give a brief answer. It's going to go over the data, give a brief answer to the problem. And if you want to know more, you can click a button and it'll take you to an expanded version of the issue. And if that still isn't satisfying, you can click again and it can take you to a very comprehensive, which makes sense because we hear about, for instance, Paul Reeve with the race and priesthood, how he wrote this big, long thing and the church ended up kind of making it comprise a much smaller document that became the gospel topic essay on race and priesthood. But the way Elder Holland explained it was that it would start with a very short answer, kind of a medium-sized answer, and then a long documented article. So I looked forward to those essays coming out, but Elder Holland said essentially the same thing, that he didn't have any good answers for my questions, that they were working on those, that if we were just patient, they would come forward. But I was already aware of like the Swedish Rescue and Hans Mattsson and the whole idea of L. Tom Perry saying he had a book in the briefcase and what seems like nothing ever existing. And so when the gospel topic essays came out, I was, to say the least, disappointed in how carefully worded they are, disappointed in the whitewashing they contain, disappointed in how they really give the benefit to the church in a way that just doesn't make rational sense if you're going to present the issue fairly and transparently.
So were you genuinely open to answers that Holland might have given you, or had you already concluded the church wasn't true?
No, I'm to this day, I'm going to be honest. If somebody could come forward with really good answers, I'd be willing to reconsider my position. The trouble is, the more I read and the more I delve into it, the more problems I find. and the problems that I already know of became worse and worse.
And we talked about the disappointment when Jensen didn't have the answers.
Yeah.
But with an apostle, Mormons are taught they're prophets, seers, and revelators and special witnesses of Christ. We're taught they kind of talk to Jesus and God. And if Holland doesn't have the answers, what was that like for you?
You realize that the problems are real, and that no matter how much apologists try to pretend like, oh, we've been addressing this issue for 200 years, it should just be able to be dismissed as something unimportant. The reality is, just because a problem sat around for 200 years, if you haven't offered a solid answer that is the most rational answer, then you shouldn't expect the question to go away. So that set up sort of a awareness that there really was never going to be a great answer to these problems. Sure, apologists have answers, missing scrolls and catalyst theories. But if you're going to be a rational thinker and pick the thing that is the most likely conclusion, and on 200 issues, the critic has the most likely conclusion, then giving allowances and the benefit of the doubt over 200 times to a plethora of issues doesn't make much sense. It's irrational to do that. And so I kind of sense they didn't have good answers. So I come to a place in my head that as I'm exiting my time as a bishop, that the church maybe isn't true, but that it still could be good. And it's at this time that good friends of mine now, but at the time, just listeners, Chris Bloxam and his wife Dawn, Clay Bloxam and his wife Heather, they reached out to me as listeners to the podcast and invited me to go to Henderson, Nevada to put on a fireside. And so I went down there.
Were they believers at the time?
I would say they were in a comparable position to where I was, where they understood that there were issues. They understood that they were serious issues, that there weren't great answers, that they had hope that they could figure it out. And in the meantime, they were going to choose to believe and be active participating Latter-day Saints.
Okay.
And when I went to Henderson, they flew me down there, put me up and manned up in the Aria, which was the nicest hotel we'd ever been in our entire lives. And it was just an incredible night. Open up the curtain and there's downtown Las Vegas and you're up on the 30th floor or whatever.
They must have really, really appreciated your podcast.
Yeah. And they had made it into a big event. They were going to have a meal catered, put chairs in the backyard, have, 40, 50 of people they knew, and then people that those people knew who had doubts and questions come and sit down. And then my job was to stand up and resolve everybody's faith concerns. And the fireside happened. 6 o'clock was the dinner. 7 o'clock was brought me out. I said a few words. We had a Q&A. So at 7 o'clock, I start addressing 50 people or so who had questions. And they're asking everything, all the things that, you would get asked, I would get asked by a room full of people who had doubts. How do you make this work? How do you make that work? And I tried my best to give a soft, apologetic answer while also validating that their concerns were real, that the things they were thinking about were legitimate, that these questions don't always have great answers, that some of it looks really icky in terms of Joseph Smith's integrity or his behavior towards other people, especially, girls. And we ended up going to like midnight. So 10 o'clock, it was supposed to end. And people are like, no, I'm not leaving. Like some people left, but the majority of people are like, no, I'm staying. And people kept asking questions and wanting to talk. And what about this? And what about the apologists say that? And when it got all done, Chris and Dawn approached me and said, what do you think about living in Utah? Like, is there any chance you might consider moving? And I said, what are you guys thinking? And they said, we just really like you. As we had spent time together, they put us up in the Aria. When we got done at the Aria, Chris and Dawn and Amanda and I were hanging out. And I was telling, math is one of my favorite subjects. And I was telling Chris about the martingale method and how it's used in roulette. And how if you bet on black and if you double down if you lose, you double down again and you keep doubling down. And there's a small risk that you'll lose a ton, but there's actually a pretty high risk that you'll win some. And so Chris, and the Bloxams, Chris is so much looking like, let's have a fun time. Let's do something fun. And he said, let's go play. Let's go try this. And so I was like, whoa, wait a minute. I don't have any money. I'm like, he goes, don't worry about that. And they owned the 4 family pawn stores in southern Utah. And obviously owning a business, he's got a little bit of spending money. So he pulls a few $100 out and we sit at the roulette table and we make them money. We're doing this thing. I said, hey, let's try this. And he does it. And I'm scared to death because I don't know this guy that well. I just met him. But he's like, let's throw a few $100 on the roulette table and let's see what happens. And then I think I won them $300 or $400 that day. They made some money. And from that moment forward, we just hit it off. That night, we had spent time out on the strip, just walking around. They got us, me and my wife, frozen hot chocolates, and we just talked Mormonism for hours. And we just hit it off. And so after this fireside had happened, he's like, I really like you. Like, we're really connecting with you. Is there any chance you'd move to Utah? And so my wife went to bed that night. We talked and said, hey, what would it take? We'd always been looking for an opportunity. I worked at essentially a dead-end job. I'd been in a floor covering store for 16 years, and I was still the lowest seniority salesman on staff. And I could sense it was never going to be something that could provide a living for my family where we could get out from under this living day-to-day kind of as we were. So we threw out some numbers, gave those to the Bloxhams, and they said, hey, I think we can work with these. And so they reached out maybe a month later or something and set up a chance for me and Amanda to go down and kind of do a 3-day trial, kind of get to know them a little better, spend some time in the pawn shop. Amanda got a chance to go out with Dawn and Heather, who was Clay, Chris's brother Clay's wife. And they started looking at houses that were for sale and getting an idea of what it would cost for us to rent or to buy. And the 3 days I was out there, pawn shop was great. On the way drive back to the airport to go back to Ohio, they offered me a position. And then in April of, I think, 2000, was it February, April of 2000, somewhere in there, I moved 2015. Early in the year, 2015, I moved my family to southern Utah. And I went down a month early, drove the drive, took a little nap at a truck stop, and then drove the rest to Utah. And went to Family Pawn the next day to start working. And the idea was that I would manage one of the stores, but it would take about a year of training. And my family came down about a month later, and after about 6 months of training, they threw me into their Hurricane location to manage the store. And go ahead.
Well, and normally I try to avoid being self-referential, but there's something really interesting to me here that I think is kind of historical that I also want to connect with you about, because I don't know any other people that can really relate to the things that I've experienced. And also by the end of this interview series, I want to talk about the void that might still exist to this day. But there's 2 things that I'm noting from this part of the story for you. One is that you're this convert who works, selling carpeting or whatever, and yet you're being flown out to Nevada/Utah to be an authority or an expert to a, 6 or 8 generation pioneer-based Mormon faith tradition. Like, and I can also just, so like how crazy that must have been for you as like a Sandusky, Ohio carpet salesman to be in such demand by really smart and wealthy people.
Yeah.
That must have been really mind-blowing for you. And you kind of already referenced that when you're put up in the hotel. But the other thing that I think is just really worth noting, and this is something I experienced in, let's just say 2007, 2008, all the way back to 2005, is how hungry questioning Mormons are for someone to step in and solve the faith and doubt problem. They will pay money and they will give their time and attention and loyalty and devotion almost at a level of worship to someone who can like stand up and say, I've got the answers. You can still have faith and believe, because Mormons are just so thirsty for someone to solve the problem. And by 2015, I had kind of fallen out of graces and disappointed everyone, because I had those people reaching out to me in 2005 and 6 and 7 and 8 and 9, but then I just couldn't keep it together. It just got too overwhelming, and I got overloaded by all the LGBT deaths and all the divorces and all the, you know what I mean? So it's almost like a baton was handed off because I'm excommunicated in 15 and the Bloxhams are bringing you out to Nevada, Utah to kind of take over the mantle of the thoughtful, faithful Mormon podcaster. So, I mean, it's, and part of why I'm mentioning all that, again, isn't to be self-referential. By the end, we're going to ask, where's that person now? But you took over the mantle then.
Yeah. I'd done a little bit of that. I'd went to Sarnia, Canada, did a presentation there. I was invited to Indiana near Purdue University to be a featured speaker at a youth conference for the stake or multi-stake youth conference they did there. But this going to Henderson was just, I was enamored that somebody thought that my voice was important enough to be helpful. The folks' questions were deeply sincere, and it was an incredible night. And the reason I told the story was because going to Southern Utah gave me a chance to get away from my Midwest ward where I'd converted to. And it allowed me, as I came here to Utah, it allowed me to kind of begin to maybe think about the world a different way. And so being, of course, doing a Mormon podcast in Ohio is sort of counterproductive. You can't really be in touch with anyone other than, a Skype call or something. And so that was, I think, a big part of it. Being in Southern Utah allowed me to really kind of take a break from feeling the loyalty to my ward family and just showing up for the sake of these are the people I love, and gave me the chance to kind of lean into figuring out what was Mormonism. And of course, 2015 is also the year that the November policy happened. And that was big because I was at a point where I thought maybe the church isn't true. Probably it isn't. There was even a moment where I tell myself I'm going to tackle the CES letter, and I print it off and I'm going to read it and highlight it, make markings. I'm going to go find all the answers to this. And I'm just going to do a podcast, maybe 5 of them, maybe 10 of them, where I just solve all these problems. And as you well know, the problems themselves can't be easily solved. And knowing that I couldn't solve that, being away from the ward, having a chance to...
Okay, wait, so you tried to resolve the CES letter?
I read through, and I got like halfway through, and I thought, I would have to make so much conjecture to solve these that I just am not going to do it. And so I took the thing and I set it on top of our piano at the time and said, no, I'm not going to be able to do that. And again, being away from the ward, I'm in this Utah ward, and things are different here. I don't have the street cred. I wasn't baptized in this ward like the one I'd come from. In the one I'd come from, everybody trusted me. If I raised my hand in class and said, hey, that historical point isn't accurate, everybody knew that Bill Reel did his research and we got to trust him. Like, he knows the history better than we do.
And that you'd been bishop.
Yeah. And now I go to Utah, where everybody's like, yeah, that's just the guy who moved in, and he's just the one who's always poking at things, always pushing back at stuff. And the ward got really uncomfortable with any correction that I would offer. If I sat in Sunday school and they're doing, the one in particular was they did the lesson on Thomas Marsh and Simon's Writer. And I remember telling the bishop, like, hey, just so you know, that material for that lesson isn't true. Like, these guys, their lives are complicated. These might be part of a list of reasons they left for, but Thomas Marsh didn't leave simply because of some milk strippings. And it's also made more complex by the fact that Joseph Smith gets to decide that case. Meanwhile, his plural wife, one of his plural wives, is the woman that's in the dispute with Marsh and his wife over the milk strippings. So once you know the context, you understand that, of course, Joseph Smith's going to side with his plural wife. Simon's Writer left for multiple reasons. There's lots of things that were going on in his life that were complex. And the bishop looked at me and said, well, how do you know you're right? And I said, I know because I've read more. Like, I've read the history. I've read the context. I've went and searched up what Thomas Marsh's biography is, essentially. If we read about his life, we understand the historical context. It got to the point where in Sunday school, if I raised my hand, the Sunday school teacher would say, we're not taking answers from you, in front of the whole class. And so what used to be Christmas, I mentioned in the last part that going to church was like Christmas. What used to be Christmas ended up being me leaving church with my hand shaking as I'm going to church up in Santa Clara and feeling like it was emotionally harmful to me to be going every Sunday. And so the November 2015 policy comes out where the children of LGBT folks aren't permitted to participate in the saving ordinances of the gospel. And that made no sense to me. Agency, and how do you punish someone else when we're all punished for our own sins and not Adam's transgression? And when you have all this doctrine that says that everyone has to be accountable for themselves, and then you come up with a policy that says because your parents are this thing, you're somehow not able to be part of it. And even if you go through the mental gymnastics of going like, well, they can still go to church. You're like, well, they can go to church, but they can't exactly participate. And how much shame do we feel when our peers get to do things and we're not allowed? It ends up just hurting somebody. And so when that policy came out, it was a moment where I said, oh, the church is not only probably not true, it's also not good. And
let me ask, prior to that, though, as I mentioned, Denver Snuffers excommunicated in 13, Kate Kelly in 14, and me in 15. When I got excommunicated, I wondered how that and the other excommunications even impacted you. There was a part of me that thought, why aren't more people outraged? You know what I'm saying? So how did you process the excommunication of us three?
Yeah, I was well aware that there's a line and you can't cross that line. And I saw what you guys were doing in trying to shine a light on the truth, trying to make sure the history in its full scope is available, that people understand both sides of the issue. Excuse me. But that you crossed what the church implicitly or explicitly set as its line. It's made it clear. You can only go so far.
What's the line?
The line is that you can't criticize church leaders. The line is not that you believe figuratively in the Book of Mormon. The line is not that you have questions about Jesus Christ being the literal Messiah. The line is that you deem these prophets, seers, and revelators to either be dishonest or some other form of lack of ethics or integrity. And I remember along the way recording the episode, but not publishing it, of the Elder Holland, Liar, Liar, Pants on Fire, because I knew it crossed the line. And I left it in my drafts for months and months and months. In the meantime, as this is all going down in Santa Clara, Utah, I'm meeting with the stake president on a regular basis. I've got those conversations recorded. I've never released them, but there's 3 or 4 of them where I sit down every few months with him, and he says like, hey, the brethren are asking me to sit down with you. How are things going? And of course, you know this process well.
Is this because your podcast started to become more strident or not?
I would in part be guessing, but I know at least in part it was because I wrote the 15 leaders of the church, telling them what I saw as a moment in time where there were multiple problems at their feet, and I offered my suggestions on how they could best handle it. I don't have the email with me, but I did post that on Facebook a few months ago, and I think it comes across as very kind. Like, hey, like, you may have some blind spots, which you can't tell them again, but you may have some blind spots. These are some of the problems: LGBT issue, church history, so on and so forth. And I laid out the email, and immediately my stake president's reaching out and saying, hey, you sent a letter to the brethren. You shouldn't have done that. I don't want to see you get in trouble. He was trying to work with me. He's like, I don't want to see you get in trouble. So let's do this. We're going to need to write them a letter and apologize. So I wrote them a letter back and saying, I'm really sorry. I shouldn't have done that. Because for some reason, because they're prophets, seers, and revelators, you're not allowed to suggest they might have a blind spot, even though they acknowledge they're fallible. And you would think anybody fallible would be willing to hear other points of view. But that seems also off limits to these men.
Yeah, it's weird because the party line is the church doesn't even make the claim that its top leaders are infallible. In other words, the party line is the church acknowledges the fallibility of their top leaders.
Right.
But you are not allowed to ever say that
No.
In church or to other members.
No.
Ever.
No.
Yeah.
And so we met with that stake president several times, once or twice with my wife, once or twice on my own, but it was every few months for him to check up on me. And I would always articulate things slightly softer than what I actually felt in my head. And I was telling you guys off the air, I think before we started recording the first episode, that when a Latter-day Saint says they have questions, they already have doubts. And when they say they have doubts, they already have disbelief, because it's not safe in a Mormon space to acknowledge where you're really at inside your head. And so it's only after you're at the very breaking point of being able to be honest about what's going on that you come forward, and you're often articulating your questions and doubts as something less severe than where they're actually at. So I gave the stake president all my questions. He wasn't able to resolve them either. I don't know. He doesn't know the history. He doesn't know how any of these things add up. And he sort of dismisses it. Super kind, great stake president, I think, great human being, but really just downplays it. You know, these aren't the things we should worry about. As one of the general authorities said, these aren't the primary questions. And it got to the point where leaving church with my hands shaking, and I would have headaches all day on Sunday. I decided just to step away from activity. So it was on a Sunday morning. I'm laying in bed. My wife has to teach a lesson that day in primary. And I look over at my wife and I say, I don't think I want to go anymore. And she says, "Are you serious?" And not in any negative way. She was ready to go before I was. My kids were all ready to go before I was. I was the last one hanging on. And so as my wife is going, "Are you serious?" I said, "Yeah, I don't want to do it anymore." And so in Santa Clara, she said, "Well, let me make a phone call." She calls the primary president, says, "Hey, I'm going to turn in my books today. We're not going to be coming back. You're going to have to find a new teacher." I was serving as the financial clerk in that ward. And as you well know too, there are certain callings that once you indicate you're going to shine a light on things, they tend to take away your ability to influence others, and they tend to put you in callings where you are close to the leadership so they can keep an eye on you. And I could kind of sense that. Like, I was there to be sort of watched over and babysat and not allowed to have any impact on the rest of the members of the ward. And if I wasn't going to be able to nudge the ward members towards a much more realistic, actual, factual history of the church and all the repercussions that come from that, then there really wasn't much good in me being there. And so I stepped away. And then we shortly after bought a home in Washington, Utah.
So let me ask about that. So one of the things I've noticed, whether it was, I didn't leave the church had to kick me out. Once I was in that role of being viewed as the person, the public face who could help people stay, there was a part of me that never wanted to let that go. Mm. And I thought about Dan Witherspoon, who for many, many years had Mormon Matters podcast, who was in this public role where you talk to him privately and you'd say, "Whoa, your beliefs are barely recognizable as Mormon." But his public face, he had assumed the identity as being the guy that helped people stay. And I could just see how you almost didn't want to disappoint people and let them down. And you would come to have it be your identity as the guy that would help people stay. Katie Mount has also filled this role. She's on Marriage on a Tightrope podcast. She holds down the believing point of view. And I thought, wow, whatever Katie's beliefs have been or are, like, it's probably not easy for Katie, if she were ever to really have serious doubts or questions, to step away, because it's become her identity. So many people looked to her and Dan and others as like their hope for staying in. So I guess I'm asking you, how did you reconcile the decision to step away with knowing that, like, people loved you and your position so much, holding on the believing perspective, that they would fly you out or move you to Utah to be that guy that that defended faith.
Yeah.
How most people just can't walk away from that identity, but you started to walk away from that identity. How did you do that?
Yeah. Much earlier in the podcast at Mormon Discussion, I did an episode where I compartmentalized my beliefs in my head, in that there were parts of my brain that clearly concluded the church wasn't what it claimed to be, and there were parts of my head that wanted it to be true and chose to believe. And I was always sort of withholding being fully honest with my audience, because I felt like if I told my audience there's parts of me that really think the church isn't what it claims to be, that people are going to walk away. And so I did an episode where I finally said, I'm just going to tell them. I'm just going to tell my audience that I've got doubts, and that this isn't as easy as I put off that it is, and that these questions are real, and maybe there aren't any good answers, and the possibility is the church isn't true. And the title of the episode was Our Bad Days. And when I did the episode, I was scared. After it's over, I'm waiting for the responses to come in, and I'm expecting blowback. And what I end up getting is numerous people who said, I'm so grateful for your vulnerability. That early moment taught me that if you just be yourself, generally things work out fine in that arena of like how people perceive you. So when the moment comes that I am stepping away from Mormonism, I didn't feel any of that. The only thing I felt was that the apologists who are critical of me said things like, hey, in 3 years, Bill Reel will be out of the church. And I didn't want them to be right. So any resistance to stepping away would have had just some little tangling to that kind of a story of apologists placing bets that I was going to be no longer active in the church. But once I stepped away, like I don't know how to explain it, and you'll understand this, but the weight of doing it and trying your best to believe when your rational brain is telling you that that's the least likely answer actually comes with you feeling a lot more contentment and peace. And so Mormons are always talking about the Holy Ghost and the peace of the Spirit. But when you step away from the expectations and burden that Mormon orthopraxy is, I think it's a much lighter burden to carry. It's just a much lighter life.
So you talked about like your hand shaking when you would leave your Sunday ward experience. Mm-hmm. But what about that decision to go on the podcast?
Yeah.
By the way, you're earning money.
Yeah.
You've got a bunch of followers there that probably mean a lot more to you than your ward members by this point.
Yeah.
Like that decision to inform your audience that you no longer believe and are stepping away on the podcast, that's a much bigger decision than stepping away from your local ward.
Yeah.
So how do you describe the burden of on the podcast holding down the defender of belief? What was that burden like?
It wasn't present. I just chose to be honest about what my journey was and to not pull any punches.
So it didn't get hard for you to defend the believing point of view?
It didn't. When the November 2015 policy came out, I put out 2 or 3 episodes about it where I said this was an emotional gut punch, that I could no longer choose to believe in a church that was deeply hurting people in this moment. And so when the time came for that, we stepped away from activity. I was just putting out episodes admitting that my hands were shaking and that I was receiving trauma and that I've stepped away from going to church. And the response was never any significant degree of criticism. It was people going, hey, take care of yourself, do self-care. And the podcast kept growing. I never felt like when I went from being being portrayed as an active outward, believer to acknowledging that the church traumatizing me and that I'm going to step away from activity and take care of myself, the podcast kept growing. So I never felt any evidence that was coming back to me that said that I was risking something. It seemed like being authentic and transparent continued to work.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I also had friends where I was in Southern Utah and
were the Bloxhams bummed to see you leave the church?
No, I think they were wrestling with the same problems at the same time. Their ward was beginning to silence them. Their bishop told them they couldn't give talks anymore. They couldn't give lessons. They couldn't participate. And they were much softer than me. They were constantly trying to help people stay in. And I was to the point where I was probably not doing that as much. And they were still being silenced in their ward too. So I think they felt very much of the same sort of feelings and thoughts.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So you make that decision to come out as a non-believer. I guess this is the point where we kind of referenced the joke that developed. As Bill Reel is, John Dehlin once was. And as John Dehlin is,
Bill Reel may become.
So you say you didn't, like, you probably heard that before, and you're saying, did you resist that of ending up like John Dehlin kind of thing?
When the first time I heard it, I thought, that's silly. How can you ever assume that someone will be just like someone else? And the reality is that deconstructing one's belief inside a high-demand fundamentalist religion has the same trajectory as hundreds of thousands, if not millions and millions of people deconstructing their beliefs inside high-demand fundamentalist religions. And so if you're willing to dive into the history, and if you're willing to be a critical thinker, and if you understand what it means to choose the conclusion that is the most rational, then the majority of people in those faiths where they are demonstrably untrue are going to sooner or later figure it out. And they're going to find themselves on the same trajectory, whereas 5 years earlier, they thought they could hang in there and continue to believe forever. Yeah.
But for you, what?
For me, I lost belief. And once we moved to Washington, Utah, we never attended church there. I still don't know to this day where the ward building is. The only building I know of is the stake center where I was excommunicated because I never went to church there. And when we got there to Washington, again, I'm not active anymore. But I did take the time to email the bishop, and I did take the time to email the stake president. And I said, just so you know, I'm Bill Reel. I do a podcast. You ought to know that I've moved into your ward. I'm sure the top leadership of the church is going to reach out to you. They're going to want you to talk to me. It's just so you know, I'm more than happy to talk. Let me know. I don't go to church anymore, but I'm more than happy to have a conversation. And at that point, the stake president said, hey, I just got called. I'm really overwhelmed with all the things I got to kind of figure out to be the stake president. If you just give me some time, I'll reach out to you. And some time went by and he never did. It was about a year after we moved there that he finally reached out. And he said, the brethren have been constantly telling me to reach out to you, and I keep putting them off. I keep putting them off so that I can get used to being a stake president and figure all these things out. But I guess I can't put them off anymore. I'll sit down and have a conversation. And so he sat down with me again, multiple times, and we talked, and I gave him the problems, and he couldn't resolve them either. And it was to the point where I knew, let me articulate this the right way. So I ended up forming a written list of 8 questions. And I picked the 8 most damaging things in my mind to the truth claims of the church. And I articulated them in what I thought was a very respectful, but you couldn't argue with it. And I said, do me a favor, President. I said, take this to the brethren and see if they can answer these. And he said, oh, I'm sure they can. And then he went off, and then he came back, 3 weeks later, whatever it was. And he said, they told me that they're not going to answer these. They're refusing to do that. And I said, sure, because they can't. In the meantime, I finally was at a point where I'm ready. I'm okay with whatever happens. Let the chips fall where they may. So I finally published the Elder Holland Liar, Liar, Pants on Fire, where I showed that on 4 or 5 occasions, Elder Holland seems to be intentionally obfuscating or telling flat out a lie. And the easiest one to point to is when he says that we have, I've been in meetings, we have double-digit state creation every week of our lives, mas a manos, as he added some Spanish in. And we could show that they had only created 1.6 stakes a week or something. And the difference in what he was claiming versus what it actually was, and he's in the meetings, and he's listening in the meetings, and he's one of the deciding voices of how the church will shift and move in these policies and these issues, it just didn't make sense. The other one was when he talked to the British broadcasting guy about Mitt Romney and the temple oaths that he'd made, the death oaths, and talking about the SCMC. There was dishonesty there.
Strengthen the church membership community.
Yeah. When he said that there was not one red cent used in Prop 8, and it was
of tithing.
And then it was apparent that the church had funded hundreds of thousands of dollars, either in goods in kind or in cash.
I think it was like 40 million. They estimated the church.
But there was a data point document that showed that the church had donated on this instance $200,000. And so in that instance, when you say not one red cent, and here's the piece of paper that says you at least gave 200 grand, you know that something's not right. And so the moment I published that episode, it was 2 weeks later, two guys in a suit and white shirts and a tie knock on my door. I open the door and, are you Brother Real? Yep. Here you go. And it's an envelope. You open it up and you're called to a disciplinary court.
Well, you had mentioned you knew with what happened to me and others.
I knew what the line was.
And you decided to cross it knowingly.
Yeah. I wasn't going anymore. I didn't believe my effectiveness of being a truth teller on the inside was done. And so now being an inactive critic of the church, it was to the point where it didn't really feel threatening anymore to my well-being than to publish that and just let it happen. And so I sort of knew the moment I published that was going to go down a track that was going to end with me not being in the church anymore. Yeah.
So what was that like? Well, first of all, Holland had been like I had, you probably know this, I had 2 conversations with Holland, and I had 1 conversation with Marlin Jensen all before I was excommunicated. So they reached out to me before they reached out to you, similarly. I know I remember feeling like, oh, I don't want to totally throw them under the bus because they're doing the best they can. And, you know, they've got a hard job and the church means a lot to a lot of people. And so I remember feeling conflicted that they knew where the bodies are buried. They weren't being fully honest. They weren't coming clean about the problems, but yet they had shown kindness to me. They had reached out, and I felt some loyalty to them to not totally throw them under the bus. What made you decide that? And there's also just the idea of like, and many do this. It's like, well, okay, for me, the church isn't true anymore, but it means a lot to a lot of people. So I'm just going to kind of go away quietly, disappear, and let those who find value in it keep finding value in it.
Yeah.
What made you, number 1, betray Holland's confidences, and number 2, become a whistleblower instead of just letting Orthodox believers live in blissful ignorance?
Yeah. When you understand the unhealthiness that a high-demand fundamentalist religion entails, you recognize that people, whether they know it or not, are being hurt. Often they know it. Folks on the margins, LGBT folks in Mormonism, for instance, women in Mormonism, people with doubts in Mormonism, people of color in Mormonism. Being a truth teller and letting the chips fall where they may, people invest their lives in this thing, and they're only given a very narrow view and narrative of what that is. And if those people were given a complete, transparent view of it with data on both sides, lots of those people would make different decisions. And people have a right to make informed decisions. People have a right to consent to when things are hurtful. People don't deserve unintentional harm or unnecessary trauma. And so being an 8 on the Enneagram, a sort of justice warrior, the truth matters, and you just tell the truth. And I wanted to nudge these guys to tell the truth.
But there is also the counterpoint, or even the irony or the paradox, that regardless of the church being true, it means a lot to a lot of people, and a lot of people find value in it.
And so those people were welcome to ignore me. Those people don't have to listen.
Yeah, but if you become a news story, and if you are the hope for all these people who want to be believers, and then all of a sudden you're publicly saying it's not true, you're kind of starting to threaten / spoil a lot of people's positive experiences. Why not just quietly fade away? Why
should the truth teller be punished? Why should the truth teller hide the truth? Why does the church get the benefit of the doubt? Why, if people believe, people are welcome to continue to believe. If somebody's standing up and going, hey, I'm just going to tell the truth. You're welcome to do whatever you want with that information. If you want to disbelieve it, go for it. People who are shining a light and compelling dishonest systems into starting to tell more of their truth, that certainly shouldn't be a bad thing.
Okay, I'm pushing back a tiny bit, but
Please.
you joined the church when you were 17.
Yeah.
And it really gave you focus and direction and confidence and an opportunity to serve.
Yeah.
It's kind of like that Buddhist metaphor. There's this raft that gets you across the river. Once you cross the river, you can destroy the raft or you can leave it for other people to get across the river. In a way, by speaking out publicly and becoming a whistleblower, you're kind of destroying the raft or trying to destroy the raft that got you across the river. Like some would say that's ungrateful.
Yeah. There is real harm being done. There are kids who take their lives. There are people whose marriages end. There are folks whose children don't talk to their parents anymore. At the end of the day, I think there's a right and a responsibility to lay all the information out and let people make informed decisions. And if they choose not to read the books or listen to the podcast or consider the logic of where the argument goes, then they're more than welcome to do that. But every person who would make a different decision if they had the information and would be better for it has a right to the truth. You can't make everybody happy. Telling the truth it avoids having to worry about which people you hurt and which people you help. You just tell the truth. Truth matters. Do you want to be lied to? Like sometimes we think we do. Maybe some people do. But I don't think anybody should ever be punished for going like, hey, if you want to be lied to, that's fine. But here's the truth.
Well, there's kind of the validity and the utility sort of dynamic where, okay, we wanted it to be true, it wasn't, but it's still valuable, it's still good. So like let it stay good for the people who find value in it.
Yeah, then keep going. My message isn't for you. My message is for the folks who are wondering what this mess is. They feel all alone. They're diving into the history. They can't make it add up. They're feeling the stress that if they come to their wife and reveal that they're going to end up in a divorce, they're worried that their kids won't talk to them, and they sense that they're all by themselves. They deserve to have the truth sit on a table and for them to know that they're not alone and this isn't some crazy thing. When you look at folks like Terrell Givens or Patrick Mason, and as they acknowledge, like, hey, you're right, this is messy. I got to imagine that folks who are already discovering that things don't quite add up get some sort of relief from that. Like, hey, there are other people in the church. And so then the believer who is strident, they want to believe, there's also the opportunity for them to go like, oh, like, there are these other voices who say that this is really messy. Maybe I'll have more compassion towards my doubting member. I'm curious, by the way, if I can maybe ask you, we did an interview before where you asked the same question. And my hunch is that you've got a way in which you frame that answers that question without having to argue about utility. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about the truth and whether it has a right to sit at the table with all the BS, right? Like we get to say Thomas Marsh left over this. We get to say Joseph Smith used spectacles. We get to say Joseph Smith's treasure digging, he only made $14 a month and he got away from it quickly. We get to say there's probably a missing long scroll.
We meaning the apologists say that.
We meaning that there's one side of the story that is safe to be told and the other side that wants to tell the truth gets to feel shame for coming forward in the first place. And so I'm curious what you see as the response to people who would pose the question you just did, because I know you don't think that. That's not the way you frame it. That what is it that makes the lies be allowed to sit at the table, but the truth teller gets shamed into seeing that he should value utility or he should value some other cause. And meanwhile, the whitewashing, the dishonesty, the obfuscation somehow gets to get a free pass, because the only way you can counter the dishonesty, the lack of transparency, is to put the truth on the table next to it.
Yeah. Well, honestly, I think our views are virtually identical.
Yeah.
I frame it in terms of informed consent, that if you know the used car you're selling people is a lemon, they deserve to know that, and it's dishonest to withhold that information.
Yeah.
Now, if they choose to buy a lemon and they pay a price that has adjusted into it, the fact that it's a lemon, and they buy it with full consent and knowledge, full informed consent, then more power to them. So yeah, it's a combination of the informed consent and all the harm. Like the Mormon Church does a material amount of harm. It does significant good in kind of that first half of life, where it gives people who are lost meaning and purpose, or people who are young and growing up, it gives them a sense of identity and structure, meaning and purpose. And that's what's always difficult is I had a good experience growing up. You had a good experience in your late teens, early 20s. But once you realize that Scientology is the same way and Jehovah's Witnesses are the same way and the People's Temple of Jim Jones was the same way, and then on the other hand, you see people literally dying, divorces happening, depression and anxiety, and families being torn apart. You get enough exposure to the problems, and you say, I don't care how much good's being done on the first half. The pain and carnage in the second half is completely unacceptable.
Yeah.
So I just like to hear other people. Maybe it's validating for me to hear you say the same things I believe. I don't know.
The nonsense always gets a seat at the table in Mormonism. The carefully worded denials, the obfuscation, the whitewashed stories and narratives like the gospel topic essays. I'm not asking that those be thrown in the trash and that only my point of view sit at the table. I'm saying there's plenty of seats at the table. Let's put all the information there, all sides, because when you allow the truth to sit there, it also compels the dishonest narratives to become more accurate. And you're watching Mormonism have to become more accurate. And you have this idea like, oh, if Mormonism weren't here, then all that good it does would be gone. No, I mean, to some degree, there'd be some other good that would replace it, right? As you've left Mormonism and you've moved on to your life as you know it, does your life still have good in it? Is there still good things happening? So there's this idea that when you're in the church, that if you leave, everything's going to go south. And it scares you so that you don't step away when you really feel like you should. And when folks actually do step away, sure, there's the dark night of the soul. It's a hard moment, but most people report that once they've gotten through that cognitive dissonance and that dark night of the soul, that their lives are actually better. And so as you're pointing out, I don't need Bill Reel's Mormon discussion or his ideas around polygamy or the Book of Abraham to be the only option at the table. Let's put all the data there. Let's put all sides there. Let's encourage people to know where to find the information and encourage people to get informed and to make decisions. I don't think the truth teller should be seen as doing harm and the dishonest person be allowed to get a free pass. That doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. And most of the time I try and conduct these interviews for the benefit of others. Right now, this topic at this point in this part 2 of our episode, this is for me. And I'm just going to say this, that I tried to do it. And I think that what I tried to do with Mormon Stories early on, I had never seen done before. I guess, let me take that back. Sunstone as a magazine and as a forum tried, in Dialogue Magazine to some extent, they tried to offer this middle ground of balancing faith with doubt. And by the early 1990s, they were dashed to bits in terms of the mainstream believing Mormon Church. The general authorities had denounced both Dialogue and Sunstone. BYU professors were scared away from participating in them. And that almost forced Sunstone and Dialogue really to become more and more critical. And they were marginalized, especially after the church started excommunicating, people who participated in Dialogue and Sunstone, which sent a chill into Mormon discourse for at least a decade, if not more. When the internet came about, let's say the Mormon Internet 2.0, 2004, I was inspired by Dialogue and Sunstone, but I was also discouraged by the September 6th. But Mormon Stories by 2005 was like this. It's like this naive optimism. No, let's try again. And with the internet this time, there'll be able to be this place in believing Mormonism where you can talk openly about the hard stuff and have faith and doubt coexisting, and somehow we're all going to be good, right? And it got dashed for me. Yeah. Mormon Stories got dashed, and then you tried to pick it up, and it got dashed. But between your demise in faithful Mormonism, which was what, 2016? When was your excommunication?
Excommunication was 2018.
2018. Mm-hmm. So between 2018 and today, which is 2023, there is no place anywhere where a faithful Mormon will entertain both believing progressive Mormons and ex-Mormons and doubters. Mm-hmm. Nowhere.
Right.
Like Terrell Givens still gives public-facing faithful firesides, but speaks in a coded language off the record in a very doubt-compatible way, but he won't voice it publicly. Same with Richard Bushman.
To the point where he privately says the church is a thoroughly corrupt bureaucracy. Right. That I sat at a table and heard him say in a group of 7 people.
Yeah. Or Richard Bushman will give a private fireside where he doesn't really think it's going to go on the internet.
Dominant narrative isn't true.
The dominant narrative isn't true.
Right.
But then as soon as he's called out on it, he tries to respin it in a different way. And everybody gets mad at the person that publishes that private recording. Somehow we're the enemy if we publish what he actually said because you don't say the quiet things out loud. But even if it's the Faith Matters podcast, even if it's the Restore Conference, even Patrick Mason, who I love, he'll do, and I love you, Patrick, and this isn't me disparaging Patrick in any way. These people are all just operating in the best way that they can within a difficult system.
Yeah.
But they'll answer tough questions, but where in Mormonism to this day is there someone trying to do what we did, which is like, hey, yeah, let's bring in Grant Palmer or the equivalent today. Let's bring in John DeLynn, but let's also bring in Richard Bushman, and let's talk about all the hard stuff. It doesn't exist to this day. Like after it failed with you, can you think of a place where faith and doubt really coexist?
Yeah.
In an unfiltered, honest way?
These men, the names you mentioned, Givens, Bushman, Patrick Mason, you can just, again, we've been in enough conversations with those folks that to some degree what they believe privately is different than what they believe publicly. And when Patrick sat down with you in your most recent long conversation with him, he said, John, you, and I think he sort of accused you, but it wasn't you that did it, it was me actually. He accused you of saying that he isn't allowed or won't permit himself to talk with believing places where he can be asked follow-up questions. And you said that wasn't me, and it wasn't you, it was me. And I sort of stand by it. Like he did sit down with you, but what recently happened? He agrees to do something where he's going to sit down with you and Jana Reese, and you're going to talk about messy issues. And the next thing you know, he can't.
And it's not because he didn't want to. He genuinely did. But
it's because the pushback.
There's so much outrage.
Yes.
And it wasn't just outrage by Orthodox believers, although he got a ton of pushback there. My understanding it was progressive Mormons who just said this is a bridge too far. Talking openly about the difficult issues, especially with non-believers. Yeah. In 2023, we're not any better off than we were in 1993.
No.
Like literally, was that 20 years later? 30 years later? We're not, 30 years later. Oh, wow, I never thought of that. 2023 is 30 years after 1993, which is the September 6th. Yeah. We're not any better off 30 years after the September 6th than we were 30 years ago. There's still no place in Mormonism to talk openly about doubts or to have a bridge between believers and non-believers.
Yeah.
It's crazy, isn't it?
What does it say about a system where the folks on the inside who understand the issues would all sort of self-admit that they know they can't exactly say what they actually think? And you and I both understand that those scholars, historians, the intellectuals who are on the inside edge, they're more than happy to put themselves in places where they answer tough questions. They're much more hesitant to put themselves in places where they'll be asked a logical follow-up question to their answer.
Yeah.
And so folks like Terrell Givens will no longer sit in spaces with you or me, because it's not just that we'll ask the hard question. They've got no problem with that. They've got a nice fluffy answer for that. The trouble is you and I know what the next logical question is that now walks them into the corner that shows that their position is less rational than the critic's conclusion. And in that regard, they don't want to be pushed.
And not because they're cowards, but because they're trying to, number one, manage their social capital. And number two, they're trying to make the biggest difference that they can from within.
Yeah.
And so they basically say, John crossed the line, Kate Kelly crossed the line, Jeremy Reynolds crossed the line, Bill Reel crossed the line. We know where the line is and we're not going to cross it. And it's not just criticizing the brethren. It's talking openly about certain third rail truth claims issues. They just have to stay away from it.
Yeah.
From them.
Yeah. I have one caveat to push back to what you just said, which is that those folks have set themselves up as the helpers of people in faith crisis. Patrick Mason's written books, Planted, for instance. Terrell Givens' written books, right? They set themselves up as truth tellers. So when moments come up, such as the SEC report that happened recently, when the SEC report says that the top leadership of the church intentionally, unethically manipulated things so that they could make more money and less people would know in ways that violated U.S. law, then if you set yourself up as a truth teller, you have a responsibility to, when the moments get hard, when the rubber meets the road and it becomes quite obvious that your church is being deceptive, that you speak up. Like, you don't always get to go like, oh, that issue would push me out. So on this issue, I'll be a truth teller and I'll help you resolve your faith crisis. And you should trust me over people like John DeLynn or Bill Reel. But then when the moment comes that your commentary is going to put you across the edge, that you go like, oh, now I'm just going to be quiet. Because then you shouldn't have been a truth teller in the first place. Like, if you're going to be honest, be honest. If we're only going to tell the truth when it's easy, what does that say about who we are? Telling the truth, we only know the integrity of a person when they do things when it's difficult. And what I've learned about those voices on the inside edge is that when it's time to call a spade, and it's obvious to everyone paying attention, those voices tend to be silent.
And if you talk to them about why, again, it's not because they disagree with us, and it's not because they're cowards.
They privately told me they agree with me.
Yeah.
Some of those voices.
But it's just they're basically saying we want to maintain influence. Like Patrick has said, I feel called to influence left of center moderate and right of center moderates within the Mormon Church. And he found out that announcing that he was going to do a podcast with me called Mormon News Weekly and Jenna Reese, that he would jeopardize his ability to influence moderates in the church. And so it's not cowardice. It's simply pragmatism. What do you think? Is that, for you, is that A, respectable, or B, unethical or cowardly, or somewhere in the middle?
As long as everybody who's looking to those voices to solve the problems for them recognize that they're self-admitting that sometimes they're going to tell you the truth and sometimes they're not, to go ahead and cover their ass.
Okay, they're not telling the truth. They're remaining silent when the topic becomes too radioactive.
Then when do I know when to trust them and when not?
Well, you can always trust them. They just won't always offer commentary on all the problems. They'll stay silent when when they're preserving their capital or their memberships, basically.
Man, whether you believe Mormonism is true or not, there are souls at stake. And if you are only going to tell the truth when it's convenient for you.
But framing it as telling the truth implies they're being dishonest.
But doesn't the church teach that dishonesty is also the withholding of truth? Isn't that in its gospel principles manual? Doesn't the church tell you that one form of dishonesty is not telling the truth but saying nothing when you know the truth is something else? Doesn't it? Yeah.
I mean, I was taught by the Mormon Church what complete honesty is.
Yeah.
And it's not withholding the full truth.
So why is the truth teller me or the truth teller you being punished? Like, I understand wanting to stay and have influence. They're welcome to do that. They're going to continue to do it tomorrow. It's fine. But all I'm saying is that everyone who's listening to those voices needs to understand that they selectively choose when to help you and when to protect themselves. And that those aren't the same thing. And that if you're going to go to them for answers, you need to understand that sometimes you're getting a good answer and sometimes you're getting something else that is meant to keep them protected, but not really give you the full information so you can make an informed decision.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I want to be careful with this part because I see them as honorable, good people.
Me too, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I really
there's multiple facets and components to this complex conversation. Somebody protecting themselves doesn't make someone bad. It's just that the people who are taking their advice need to know what it is up front. Let's not call it apples when it's oranges.
You're saying more informed consent.
Yeah. So if I'm, and I won't necessarily name a specific one of them, but if I'm that group of individuals, then my obligation is to tell you up front. I can't tell you everything I would like to. The things I do tell you, I will try to be helpful and honest. But there are going to be moments where I'm silent because the church isn't what I thought it would be on this particular issue, and I can't frame my view outwardly in a way that's going to allow me to stay safely in the church. Then tell people that.
So just like cigarettes have a warning label that says cigarette smoking can cause cancer.
Yeah.
You're almost saying faithful Mormon apologists should have a disclaimer at the beginning of their book or at the beginning of their fireside. You believers need to know that if any issue comes up during this book or this fireside or this discourse or this podcast that is truly deeply problematic that the brethren are not going to like, these faithful apologists are going to remain silent and not speak out, sometimes about the most important issues.
I'm saying it is dishonest on one end to write books claiming you have answers to the problems and that you're here to be the safe guide to help people through their faith crisis. And on the other end, when it's uncomfortable or there's risk to your profession or career or influence, that you suddenly don't tell the truth so that people can make informed decisions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, they kind of are carrying water for the institutional church.
And which allows the church to perpetuate harm and to make healthy changes much more slowly. In other words, if when the SEC report had came out and we all had a chance to read it and we all saw that our top leadership, the first presidency, group after group, right? Hinckley, Monson, Nelson, Faust, Eyring, Uchtdorf, Oakes, at the very minimum, and probably the other 12 too, right? But at least those top guys. What would have happened if Terrell Givens and Patrick Mason and Jim Bennett and all the other folks that are these voices in the space came out and said what they really thought? Would it have compelled the church to behave differently and be more accountable to what it did? It might have. And when
I think what would have happened is there would have been another round of excommunications. They all would have been cut off.
Which also would have been eye-opening and risky to the church.
Yeah, they would have all been cut off.
Yeah.
Their influence. And by the way, I think I'd take Patrick Mason at his word.
Yeah.
That he's a sincere believer. So it's not like he's hiding and lying to cover up something he knows to be untrue.
Right, but when you withhold information that would allow somebody to make an informed conclusion, whether it's a conclusion you agree with or not, when they are given the information that allows them to make an informed conclusion about how they're going to make important decisions in their life, and you hold that back, you have a right and a responsibility to acknowledge to that person that I'm not giving you everything here. I would like you to stay. I'd like you to believe. Again, I do also think these men are good. They're trying to fix things in a different way than I am. But a whole load of people are being deceived into thinking they're being told the truth all the time, and that it's John DeLynn and Bill Reel who are being dishonest.
The full truth.
Right.
I think they're telling the truth, but they're not telling the full truth.
And when you have an opportunity to tell the full truth and you don't, and people get hurt in the process, we have to own that there is some level of deceptiveness in that. And you can argue with me, but I would simply point back to the Gospel Principles Manual, which says that it is church doctrine and theology that when you withhold the truth, when you could have shared it and someone got hurt, you were being deceptive.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's at least a fair argument.
Yeah.
But I don't think they're even able to engage in the argument, honestly.
They can't.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's also complicated by this is, at least when it comes to Bushman, Givens, Mason, Fluman, there are financial entanglements. And I'm not saying that they're consciously dishonest or sellouts. I'm not saying that. But there are financial and reputational and occupational entanglements for Givens, for Bushman, for Mason, for Fluman, for others. Yeah. You know, even Robin, what is it?
Jensen.
Robin Jensen,
yeah.
and
works at the church history department.
And Marlin Jensen and others.
Yeah.
The pensions.
Yeah.
There's really serious implications for them that just, it takes a real, I mean, I think that's why Grant Palmer's kind of a hero, is because it's really rare the person that's going to put their career or their pension or their reputation at risk. You know, most people are going to stop short of putting their career, their reputation, their social influence, and their salaries, and eventually their retirements at risk.
I might make the same decision they do in the position that they're in. The difference would be, it doesn't get you excommunicated and it doesn't get you fired if you just look at the folks and say, hey, I'm not able to tell you everything that I think. I'm not going to be able to give you the information that's running through my head on both sides. You're going to have to make your own decision, and you're going to have to know that I'm only being partially helpful.
But that's like that's like pooping in the middle of the cake. You know what I mean? If a bunch of people are coming thirsting for answers, that they want cake, and you're like, I'm going to take a dump right in the middle of the cake. Forgive my graphics. I'm going to take a big dump right in the middle of the cake, but feel free to eat around the poop.
Doesn't informed consent mean you know that there's shit in the cake?
Yeah.
Informed consent means I know that before I eat the cake, there's some shit in it.
Yeah.
That's informed consent. Informed consent requires all the information on the table.
Yeah.
So it's okay to protect yourself. I might do the same, but then you owe it to people that you acknowledge that you're protecting yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I just want to say, still, there's influence that Bushman, Givens, Mason, Fluman, and all the others, there's positive change they're going to be able to make from within.
They're part of the good guys.
You and I are never going to be able to make. So say it again.
They're some of the good guys. They're on the right team.
Yeah, they are.
I'm not. People will confuse me because of how directly I'm saying it, that what I'm doing is saying they're bad guys and they're doing something wrong in terms of protecting themselves. I'm not. I'm saying that by protecting yourself and pretending you're not, you're being deceptive to the audience you claim to be helping. But what you're doing is you're actually having that audience make decisions that are not based on informed consent.
Yeah. And so I guess one way to think about it is life is messy, and there's no one there's no one who kind of fully has their hands clean, including you and me.
No. And in fact, if I were to ask you what you regret most, one of the things I regret most is the moments that I said things to soften it and I wasn't more honest and truthful about what I actually thought inside my head.
So you did this.
I did the same thing.
These critiques you have,
didn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I still do.
But let's own it.
Yeah,
that's the thing. Let's just own it.
Yeah,
I shouldn't have done that. People deserve to make informed decisions. I do think it's good to slow people down. I think it's great to have Fair Mormon and the church and Terrell Givens and John DeLynn. Because what happens is when someone knows it, they sort of know it's not true, but there's too much relationship risk with their spouse or their children. They get to create this mental gymnastic path in their head, this Rube Goldberg machine. That's a kudos to Patrick Mason too, I think. No, that's
Adam Miller.
Thank you. Adam Miller.
Yeah.
Rube Goldberg machine so that they can slow down and preserve the relationships in their life. I'm all for all of these perspectives existing. The trouble is when you take on the critic as if you are the truth teller, and in reality, you are also obfuscating the truth. You are deceiving the very people you're attempting to help. Regardless of what choices, you can't base what you do on whether it means good for Jerry and bad for Susie. Because what kind of world are we in if we try to gauge that all the time? Just tell the truth. Or if you need to protect yourself, acknowledge that you're doing that, which is also the truth. It seems completely honest to go, I'm just not going to be able to tell you everything. And if you want to look to me for answers, that's great. I'm going to be as helpful as I can. But my views are such that I can't exactly tell you what runs in my head.
Can you imagine? It's one thing, like I'm in awe.
They would no longer do firesides, would they?
When I see Patrick Mason standing up in a fireside and saying, let's talk about polygamy, I'm like, woo, like who in the world would have ever thought in 1993 that like the top faithful scholar for the church would be holding firesides, addressing polygamy head on. Like Patrick came on my podcast and said Joseph Smith's polygamy looked a lot like sin to him.
Yeah.
And he's still a faithful member in good standing. Like on the one hand, I think who in the world would have ever envisioned that day ever coming in Mormonism? But yeah, if he were to stand up and start the fireside by
useless,
saying,
isn't it?
I'm not going to be able to tell you everything I really think and feel, but let's talk about what I can tell you. It's almost like he's dead in the water at that point.
If a clock's only right twice a day or a calculator's only right half the time, you don't trust either one.
So there's no, I mean, honestly, there's no way for anybody to really win here. Because you either end up like you and me, out, marginalized, cut off, and defamed.
Yeah.
Or you have to stay in and not be fully honest.
And can I acknowledge, again, I am built a certain way. I'm an 8 on the Enneagram, justice warrior sort of type. I have certain values. My values aren't going to be the same values that you have. They're not going to be the same values that Terrell Givens has or Patrick Mason. Those values are going to influence how I perceive as the right decision to make in a complex, non-binary, not black and white world. But from my seat and acknowledging that other perspectives exist, such as you pushing back and me also going like, hey, John's got a valid point. It's just not how I see the world. These men do a disservice when on one hand they say, I'm going to answer questions. Give me anything on polygamy. And then somebody says something about 14-year-old girls, and the next response is, the past is a foreign country. We do things differently there. Because that answer isn't sufficient, and here's why. Whether the past is different or not, we teach that we have a heavenly Father who's consistent. And if you're going to try to sell me on a God who makes it appropriate for a grown man to enter a father-daughter relationship with a woman such as Lucy Walker, a girl like Lucy Walker, who's 15 or 16 years old, and Joseph Smith goes out into public and says, this is my daughter, because her dad's been sent on a mission and her mother's died, and so Joseph's taken her into his home. And now Joseph, a month later, is reaching out to her and saying, hey, you're supposed to be a plural wife of mine. What kind of eternal Father in heaven? allows his prophet to form a father-daughter relationship with a girl who's staying in his home, and then asks that prophet to then change that relationship to an intimate romantic one. And so it's not about whether the past is different. And when these guys answer questions, and it's worse with the apologists, as you well know, but when these guys answer questions, they're often catering to the level at which the audience is at. And a frank discussion requires us to say it makes zero sense that God would ask his prophet to change his father-daughter relationship with Lucy Walker into an intimate romantic one. That's nonsensical. And any conjecture to make it fit or work is absurd.
That was beautiful. Let me ask you a follow-up question then about Mormon apologists. I was talking, it turns out David Bokovoy, who I've had on Mormon Stories, Old Testament scholar, CES instructor at Harvard, MIT, brilliant guy, love him. He's out of the church now. He used to be friends with Terrell Givens, really close friends, apparently. And at some point, once Dave left the church, he doesn't have a relationship with Terrell Givens anymore. But I expected him to say, well, I hate Terrell Givens now. He blew me off as a friend, blah, blah, blah. What he does is evil and bad. Bokovoy said to me that he thinks these neo-apologists, these Givens, Masons, Flumans, they play an important role of giving people a soft landing because, you're in this sort of Fowler stage 3 Mormon orthodoxy, literalistic, and your life is totally wound around Orthodox Mormonism. If you just go immediately to like church is false, I was betrayed, it's all over, maybe that's just too much of a shock to your system.
And I agree with it.
So then there's this middle ground of Mormon nuanced progressive Mormonism that gives people that pathway ultimately to leaving the church, but it gives them kind of a soft landing and a bit of a transition time. So frankly, they don't blow up their own lives and they don't blow up the lives of all their friendships and relationships around them. It's basically the role I played. It's the role you played. And now it's the role that they're playing. Bushman and Givens and Mason and Fluman, they're all playing that role. So in that sense, are you in favor of that role? Even though you say it's not fully honest, is it still good even if it's not fully honest?
I'm in favor of all the way stations existing. And I think if somebody reads the CES letter as a full-in believing Mormon and leaves the next day, that there's a possibility they might be worse off than somebody who took the time to try to wrestle with it, tried to make it work, leaned on apologetics, leaned on the neo-apologist, and tried to give it a go for a year or two. But it's not up to me to choose for other people what's best for them. My job is to be an advocate for putting all the information on the table and let your brain figure out what you need in order to make the healthiest, wisest decisions for your life. So if you decide you want to take your time, you can go spend your time in Fair Mormon. You can spend your time in Terrell Givens' books. And if you want the full truth and you want to make a decision more quickly, then you can go read the CES letter. And if you don't want to buy into any of that problems at all, you can go read Fair Mormon's Mental Gymnastics and make it solve that way. But by putting all the information on the table, you respect people's individual choice and you let people make the best decisions for themselves, which you never knew the best for anyone else anyway.
What's it like to see this new generation following you, the Faith Matters podcast, the Restore conference, the Faith Again?
Yeah.
Like, what's it like to see this emergence of a progressive, faithful Mormonism that failed for me and failed for you?
Yeah.
Now others are carrying the banner. Do you have a sense for whether they're going to meet a different fate, or have things changed so much in Mormonism that like the genie's out of the bottle and it's now safe to kind of do what you were trying to do or not?
I am more than happy to have all the variations of belief out there. I don't have a problem with Faith Matters. I don't have a problem with
but I'm more asking about what you predict their fate will be.
I think the people that cross the line will be gone, and the people that don't will keep it going. And I think there are certain people in the church who are continually willing to keep it going. So I don't anticipate that Scott Gordon, Steve Densley, or John Lynch will ever lose their testimony enough that they would outwardly say the thing that would have them crossing the line. And there are other folks within Fair Mormon who come and go all the time because they get into Fair Mormon and they realize it isn't true and they deconstruct things and out they go. And so I think every person's going to have their own journey and their own path. And some people, again, read the CES letter and they throw in the towel tomorrow. And other people spend years and years slowly moving through all of it, trying to make it work because they want nothing more than Mormonism to be true.
And I mean, I think that's exactly what happened with Patrick and me is Patrick started to cross the line.
Yeah.
And a bunch of people said, don't cross the line.
Yeah.
And so he said, you're right, I better not cross the line.
Which reinforces the thing I started off saying, which is these guys are not safe to have conversations where the logical follow-up question is going to be asked.
Yeah. And that's just boundary maintenance, right? I mean, every organization does boundary maintenance.
Yeah. So be careful about putting yourself out as a truth teller and be careful about suggesting that you're the trusted source for people to resolve their faith crisis. Because that's not exactly honest.
Yeah, and don't tell too much truth as a Mormon or you get in trouble.
Yeah. And what does it say? Like there's that quote, right? Like you know what can't be questioned by the things you can't ask questions about, right? Like there's this idea that you can't exactly poke at certain things. It's not allowed. Yeah. And what kind of system is it where you can't raise a hand and go, something's not right here?
Yeah. And there are challenges being out of the church that we will be talking about in your part 3. But there's also attacks that I know Bushman and Givens and Mason and others are likely carrying, which is, you're not being fully honest.
When you're not authentic.
You're not being fully authentic.
When you're not authentic, there's a burden. Now that burden, there's another burden when you are authentic and you risk things. I'm not going to sit here and pretend it's beautiful one direction and it's ugly the other. No matter which way you choose to live, if you choose to fit in and compromise yourself in some way, that comes with a burden too. If you're authentic, you also risk things.
And one ungenerous way to look at that is, oh, well, they're sellouts or they're dishonest. Another way is to say they're heroic because they're staying in the fight, preserving their capital, preserving their influence to make a positive difference in ways you and I both think are heroic, and they're carrying that tax or burden or cognitive dissonance of inauthenticity and conscious, I almost want to say ethical dishonesty, right?
Yeah.
Of like, yeah, it's ethical dishonesty.
Yeah. And by the way, thank you for saying that I also think they're heroic. I do. I think they're heroic. What I'm speaking to, though, is the people on the ground who are looking because they realize something doesn't add up here. They're asking questions. They're reading books. They're listening to the Faith Matters podcast. And what they perceive is that, oh, there's not any real problems here. Like, oh, yeah, prophets are fallible and the past is different. And you're setting people up to see you, and I mean you by the voices that are doing that, to see those folks as having kept them from learning the thing that they might have been better off learning. So yeah, they're heroic. And we're all hurting and helping people at any given moment, right? Like you and I both know that most people are happier out, but we also know that's not everyone. I've had people sit 5 feet from me and go, Bill, I really do wish the church was true, and I wish I could go back. And if I could go back right now and flip a switch and forget the last 3 years and go right back to believing exactly as it was, I would do it because it's been nothing but harm to me. Me leaving has hurt so many things. I lost my wife. I had this happen. I lost my job. I'm miserable. Those stories are true too. I don't think they are the majority. I think it is, I would guess 90 or more % of people are grateful to you when they left the church and go, you were a part of that journey. Thank you for helping me get out. But there's no doubt that there is a small segment of people who are hurt.
Okay, and this is just me
Please.
Inquisitor. If Patrick Mason and Spencer Fluman and Richard Bushman and Tara Givens are all heroic for not crossing the line and staying in to maximize their influence, does that mean we kind of blew it? That we kind of became less heroic because we couldn't keep within the right boundaries to maximize our influence, and we kind of washed out? It's kind of like a Navy SEAL that, his head keeps getting shoved underwater. Some can deal with the harassing and the distress and they make it, and then others can't and they wash out. What about the perspective that you and I just washed out because we couldn't maintain that boundary to maximize our influence?
Is your influence bigger today or then? Is my influence
With
bigger
who?
today or then?
I mean, it depends on with who, right? With believing
Yeah.
Mormons, my influence has decreased significantly.
Yeah.
With church leadership, actually, I think my influence is bigger.
Yeah. I would suggest that by having all kinds of perspectives, including those who just state straightforwardly that not any one of these truth claims is in the church's favor, that people are benefiting significantly from that conversation. Let's say we take you and me out. Do we go one step back and take those people out too? Like, how far back do we go? And at some point, you've gone all the way back to the church just being allowed to say whatever it wants without being questioned. The only thing that allows folks like Terrell Givens or Patrick Mason to even exist is the Eugene Englands and the Sterling McMurrins. And so having people stand up and question, having people who get excommunicated as of September 6th, having folks who are adamant that I'm just going to tell the truth in its fullness, I'm just going to be complete, that's what creates the space for anybody to have questioned anything at all. Yeah.
So it's kind of a paradox. We're holding down an essential place.
Sam Young gets excommunicated for telling the brethren they need to have two adults in the room. Sam Young is excommunicated, and a month later, President Nelson makes it so that parents can request that two adults be in the room. That makes zero sense to me and probably to you too. In other words, you acknowledge that the person brought an actual, sincere grievance to you, that you were the one being unhealthy, and then you punish them and fix the problem, in part. You get rid of Kate Kelly, and then you decide that women can go ahead and attend priesthood session of conference if they want to.
And they kind of got rid of the men's, afternoon session of general conference eventually. That's directly a result of ordained women, right?
Yeah.
Or like sister missionaries on missions having a more leadership-based role. Like, there's so much that came out of ordained women.
How healthy is the church if nobody crosses a line?
Yeah.
Do you want to live in 1850s Mormonism? Go out to Colorado City.
Touche.
Yeah.
All right. So let's talk about your excommunication and how you experienced it.
Yeah.
And what you want to say about that whole story.
Yeah. So,
and we have a whole episode or two on Mormon
I'll
stories.
be really quick.
No. I'm just letting my viewers and listeners know we're not going to have time to go into detail.
Sweet.
If you want to go into detail, not only did Bill and I do an entire at least episode or two on it, I think we shared the whole recording from your excommunication on Mormon Stories, I think at some point, so you can go back and go into detail. But just for those who are new to this whole conversation, what do you want to say about the excommunication?
Yeah. As that was unfolding, there's a process that the local leadership has to play by to work it from the brethren at the top want you to sit down with this person. They want you to try to get them to repent, to go silent. They want to try to scare you into not doing this anymore. So I was given chances to pull my podcast down. I was given chances to stop doing things. So they give you that first. And then there's all this like pseudo-legal stuff. Here's how the process works. We have to do this. We have to do that. Every step along the way, I tried to have it be in a way that I could get as much exposure to the data as possible. And when the time came to actually have the disciplinary court, a couple of days before, Sam Young reached out to me. By the way, thank you, Sam. Sam reached out and said, "Hey, Bill, I just want you to know, I hear what's going on. I was excommunicated recently. Here's what it felt like to me. It was really hard. I wasn't expecting certain emotional things to come up. And you will likely experience things that you weren't anticipating. But if I'm honest, that's not the case at all. My excommunication, I felt like, and I keep bumping the mic, sorry about that. I felt like I got the chance to walk in that room to tell my truth for an hour. And I went through all of it. I started with Joseph Smith's youth, and I ended with the modern prophets, seers, and revelators not being what they claim to be. And I got to tell all of it. And not only that, got to record it. And not only that, on the recording, I get my stake president saying, hey, folks, this isn't about Bill's integrity. Bill's integrity is intact. This is the fact that you cannot call church leaders liars. And my statement is, even when they lie, and his statement is, yes, even when they lie. I win. So when I walked out of there, I was actually fine. It was a long process. It was exhausting. The number of people who showed up was amazing. You being there, amazing. Media being there, amazing. The media did, I thought, a hell of a job in the local newspapers in southern Utah, covering it every step along the way. I couldn't be more proud of how I conducted myself and my attempt to get the story out about what LDS history actually is. I had no emotional trauma from that night.
Yeah, I'll just say that between my excommunication and the hordes of people that came to support me, I tried to carry that forward to Jeremy and to Sam and to you and to others. We kind of did our best to turn Mormon disciplinary councils and excommunications into like a celebration of heroicism and an opportunity to shine a spotlight back on the church and what it really is. And that's one of the things I'm most proud of collectively with everyone who helped out, because what ended up happening is the church got rid of the word excommunication, got rid of the term disciplinary council, and I think has reduced the frequency of disciplinary councils and excommunications to only really extreme settings. So in some sense, we kind of slayed that practice to a large extent.
To the point where Radio Free Mormon
is still not
threatened at all. When he clearly does a podcast that exposes the dishonesty, deception, and false narrative.
Also, Nemo the Mormon is still a member in good standing.
In spite of going to conference after conference, raising his hand, abstaining, and egging these guys on by writing the letter to Elder Oaks, the back and forth, and that whole process, how it's unfolded.
How did Nemo do anything different than you calling Oaks out as a liar?
I would argue that he was more abrasive.
And he's still a member in good standing.
Yeah.
Things have changed.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah.
It's a strange thing, isn't it?
Well, I mean, in some sense, it's a beautiful thing. Like I don't know if you ever had this moment where, I'm doing activism in the space for 10, 15 years, and then I start seeing changes happening, whether it's with disciplinary councils being renamed or like the church being better about one-on-one interviews or the church treating women better or the church changing its policies with LGBT people or the gospel topics essays come out. I start realizing, whoa, we're actually improving the Mormon church. Like our work, the net result of our work is twofold. We're getting kicked out and our families are all experiencing what it's like to be rejected and kicked out and labeled as apostates. That's one effect. But the other effect is we're eliciting positive change within the Mormon church. Like we're working full time to improve the Mormon church. That's what we do.
Yeah.
People think that we hate the church and want to destroy it, when in reality, the net effect of our work is improving the Mormon church, making it healthier and safer and more honest for its members. Have you ever had that realization?
You and I both have friends or people that we've sat at a dinner with who have said, I just want to see this thing burn down. And my response every time is that if you make the effort that your only goal here is to see it burn down, you're going to waste a lot of your life's energy and you're going to die. And this thing is still going to be here with its $300 billion in another 10 years, right? It's going to go forever. So if your goal is that it burned down, you're going to waste your life trying to get there.
It's like banging your head against the wall.
The real goal should be to help people make informed decisions. And for those who stay, more power to you. And for those who leave, more power to you. Like, let people make their own decisions about what they do with their life.
Yeah. It's about promoting informed consent. And then for those who need to change or leave, helping them have the best experience. And believe it or not, a third is making the church healthier for those who stay within it.
And you can see, on one hand, you have the idea that not all the changes it makes are good. I'll give an example. Doctrine and Covenants is crystal clear that when a disciplinary court is held at the stake level, that the person in the disciplinary court has a right to those 12 high councilmen being in the room. One of the changes the church made, based on, I think, Jeremy Runnels and Bill Reel, is that they now no longer require that those 12 men be in the room. It's just the stake presidency if he wants it to be. But that's a violation of the Doctrine and Covenants, which says that person has a right. So the brethren, in their fear of having people sit down and record themselves talking to everyone in that room and the possibility of disrupting those 12 men, the church now has violated its own revelations, changed the rules so that you and I, if we were having a disciplinary court today, the stake president would insist that it would only be him and his two counselors.
Well, that's the benefit of modern revelation, Bill.
Yeah. You can changing the D&C, but there was no new section, was there?
No.
There was no announcement of a revelation, was there? And that D&C section still sits there.
Yeah.
But you're right. When we make the church softer, by we, I mean us shining a light on the unhealthiness, and they remove, say, the sexism out of the temple.
Yeah.
They reduce the shame and fear over whether you should wear garments night and day. When they make it easier for people to not be as rigid, what they do is they reduce everyone's investment and they reduce everyone's loyalty. And so what they're doing, they may be able to hang on to the money forever. Nothing we can do to stop that. But what we can do is create a church where people don't feel as allegiant to the system, and there's so much less emotional capital that has to be spent in simply walking away. And it's happening.
Yeah. So you think the fabric of the church is weakening?
I think high demand fundamentalist religions work because they use shame and fear as a tactic. And any religion in that group that's forced to water itself down to become more
palatable, safe, healthy
to the general public and to its members ends up weakening itself anyway. Yeah. I think we're winning one way or the other.
Is the world a better place if the Mormon Church is weaker?
Is the world a better place if Scientology doesn't exist? I think that's of course. So what you're basically saying is, does the church's good outweigh its bad? First off, it is so small. Even if we count the inactive members of the church and the people who don't report themselves as a Mormon, but the Mormon Church still calls Mormon, it's 0.2% of the human population. And then you say, like, what good do they do and what bad do they do? And now you're into a subjective argument where both sides are going to go, no, the good outweighs the bad. No, the bad outweighs the good. Well, fine. Let's call it a wash. In that instance, Mormonism still doesn't matter.
But it was good to 17-year-old Bill Reel.
Yeah.
What about it's good? How about instead of it being good or bad, it's good for the first half of life. It's good for people who are lost. It's good for people who need this formative years and community and identity. And then when they're in their 20s or 30s or 40s, they can leave it behind like the raft.
Yeah, you could go to any extreme and you could use anything. You could go to the end-all, be-all of arguments and you could go Nazism was great for these few people. Like, that's true. That doesn't make it good. That doesn't make it worthwhile. We should not allow systems to be deeply deceptive and to marginalize people on invisible beliefs that can be proven to be untrue. If you make claims and your claims are demonstrably false, and some people are helped and some people are hurt, then we ought to just own that your claims are demonstrably false, give the information, and let people make their own decisions. There's nothing we can do. Mormonism is going to be here forever. It will literally be here for all time and eternity. It has too much money not to be. But it might be okay if there were a lot less members being traumatized. And you and I both know this too. People in the believing perspective often don't even know the harm that's being incurred on them until they're on the other side. And you take 100 post-Mormons who understand both perspectives because at one time they believed and now they don't. They can, with much more context and perspective, speak to the fact that they did not know the amount of harm that was happening on the front end. You can't just pretend that doesn't exist because the believer doesn't see it. It's still real.
Which is also your last name.
Yeah.
Okay, really quickly.
Please.
And I know we're almost at 2 hours now. And, we've been going all day, but I would like, one of the main goals I had was to get you in studio with high quality audio and video, spending 5 to 10 minutes giving your best summary of what were the main factors that led to your loss of faith. So if you even want to go chronologically, I want to have a good 5 to 10 minute video chunk of Bishop Bill Reel, former Bishop Bill Reel, former Mormon apologist Bill Reel, explaining to someone who's just curious, like you said, let's just say you were asked to give a fireside now, but you believe in informed consent.
Yeah.
And you're going to give that full, honest summary to that questioning Mormon who just wants to know, give me your best reasons, your best evidences that the church isn't what it claims to be in 5 to 10 minutes. I want to say go and take 5 to 10 minutes. If you want to do it chronologically, fine. Will you give that summary? Start from, if you want to start with the Old Testament, like do whatever you want.
Yeah. So I wouldn't do it the way you just suggested at all. Here's what I would do. If I was standing in front of a group of people, I would start off by talking about rational thinking. Rational thinking is that in any time where there is a disagreement of what occurred in history, on a political issue, what you have to do is you have to come up with whatever ideas each side has, whichever side comes to the conclusion without requiring more conjecture or allowances or inference. That is the most rational conclusion. So in other words, if I'm in Scientology or I'm in Jehovah's Witnesses or I'm a Seventh-day Adventist or I'm in Jim Jones's group or I'm in Heaven's Gate, those people are having spiritual experiences. Those people are, they believe with all their heart that their system is true. They have confidence that is very similar to a Mormon having confidence, to the extent where even the FLDS people bear testimony and get their testimony in the same way that we Latter-day Saints did. So having spiritual experiences doesn't solve the problem. Believing confidently doesn't solve the problem. The only way you can solve
also having scriptures and prophets doesn't solve the problem because they've all got prophets and scripture, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And so critical thinking requires that when you have to ignore your bias, which we all can't do exactly, right? But as we listen to an argument on both sides, there was a moon landing, there wasn't. There's a flat earth, there isn't. Aliens are real, they're not. None of us can exactly be sure we're getting it right, but the best we can do is to hear the arguments on all sides and to choose the conclusion that our brain tells us requires the least amount of allowances and conjecture. So now we go into the Mormon Church and we look at it. And there are things that I think are, for me, the three biggest facets of that I think are easy to show are demonstrably problematic.
Wait, can I give you some prompts and you respond?
Please.
Okay. So Old Testament, specifically Noah's flood, age of the earth, Adam and Eve, and all that.
The Tower of Babel, based on language development, is absurd, and the Book of Mormon perpetuates the story on a completely different timeline from a completely different set of people. The idea that millions of people died on the hill Ramah, that 230,000 people died on the hill Cumorah. Again, we're talking about those stories because they're also, I'm actually mixing things up. So let me say it again. You're pointing at the Old Testament. Old Testament, Tower of Babel, it's absurd.
That's not how language is developed.
Not at all.
Yeah.
When we look at stories like David is told by Saul if he wants to marry the daughter that he go fight the Philistines and bring back 100 foreskins. And so David goes and cuts off 200 and brings back a bag of 200 foreskins, laying them at the feet of Saul. It's absurd. Global flood, if you go onto Google and you type in global flood problems with, you'll come up with, there's a website that says it's like the 3rd edition of problems with a global flood. And you look through that page and the problems are enormous to the point where the intelligent, informed apologists now fight for a local flood. Because apologists are always backing up the argument to wherever it is sort of arguable, like right there's plausible deniability. You can sort of say like, well, maybe. Anytime someone changes their belief in the church, it's because the data pushed him there. The only reason Mike Ash believes that the Book of Mormon created embellished stories about the numbers that died on the hill Ramah is because he had to confront the fact that the number that is reported to have died is absurd. So then he adds extra allowances by saying like, oh, don't take them literally. They're overestimating intentionally. They're embellishing the number. But see what you've done? You've added conjecture. Why can't I just take it as it is and go, that didn't happen? So Old Testament is just so full of stories that are absurd.
What about Adam and Eve as the first humans? And the earth being 6,000 years old.
Well, the 6,000-year-old earth, again, I would go to Fair Mormon. What would they tell me? They would tell me that that actually isn't an official teaching of the church, that it's a misrepresentation of Joseph Smith's words, that even though he said 6,000 years, every year in the life of God is, every day in the life of God is 1,000 years. Like, again, we add conjecture. Instead of taking things as they are, these are the principal ancestors of the Native Americans. These are the writings of Abraham written by his own hand. It's the fact that nothing adds up that we create fluffier answers like the catalyst theory. And as RFM has pointed out, the catalyst theory sounds just like a intentional fraud. It's the exact same evidence, except now you've created a way to go like, oh, I know it looks like a fraud, but it's the catalyst theory.
So for Adam and Eve and the age of the earth, your conclusion is what?
Adam and Eve, you read book Sapiens and you try to come up with a way that there's this moment in time where there's this fully human Adam and this fully human Eve. It's absurd.
And there's no humans before.
You have to disregard science entirely and lean entirely on faith, but accept the fact that your apologists don't exactly agree with it as a literal story either.
So for you, Earth is billions of years old.
13.7 billion years ago, something happened. None of us know exactly what it is. Science does its best to pinpoint it. And since that moment, everything else can be explained from a naturalist perspective.
And organic evolution.
Easy. Spencer Wright just the other day was talking about this, where you have the original life forms on Earth, whatever they were. They are obviously going to move towards safety and food, or they're going to die. So every organism that moves towards safety and food has a better chance of living. Whatever time your environment changes, whatever adaptations that occur, if that adaptation helps you to survive, you're better off than the previous generation. And those things are going to be supported. And any adaptation that hurts your chances is going to be whittled away, and that species is going to die. And it's happened over and over again. That seems absolutely explained by science in a way that's completely credible.
Okay, so the Old Testament's got problems, but the New Testament and Jesus, that's a different deal.
This will be a lot easier. So you look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. First off, Mark is the earliest gospel, written, I think, 40 to 70 years after the life of Christ. And it ends not actually speculating on the resurrection at all. Somebody later on, based on biblical scholarship, came in and added the finishing verses and lines to Mark. Matthew and Luke were written significantly later, 80 to, I think, 110 AD. And then you've got John, who's written even later than that. And there's no way to take those 4 gospels and actually have them collaborate. If you go online and you try to be a rational thinker, and again, choose the conclusion that has the least amount of allowances, try to make the 4 gospels mesh. It can't be done without you making lots of loopholes and mental gymnastic answers to do it. Jesus, first off, the church teaches that Jesus set up his church, just like today's church is restored in the exact same manner that Christ's church was established, except that the BYU's own scholars at the Maxwell Institute recently released a book called Ancient Christians, where they argue that the church actually was wrong. Christ never did set up a church, and he was a Jew the entire time, and even the first generation and second generation of believers were Jews as well. And guess what? Biblical scholars agree. And then you try to say, well, okay, well, you've got Paul, and some people don't even believe parts of Paul were written by Paul. The story is not cohesive. And the most rational explanation is that we took a religious zealot who pushed back against the Jewish system, and we turned him into an embellished myth story. And there's plenty of evidence for that. And it's the more rational argument than trying to make it all be coherent.
What do you do with Joseph Smith's folk magic and treasure digging stuff and peepstones?
Yeah. Isn't it strange? I said this earlier. Isn't it strange that Joseph Smith, as a treasure digger, used his seer stone to locate precious treasure, gold and silver, buried in hills, protected by guardian spirits? And we all know, again, if we're sitting with an apologist, we would push and go, were there actual buried treasures? Were there Spanish silver mines? And they would have to acknowledge, if pushed, they would have to acknowledge no. So we go, Joseph Smith was doing something, whether he believed it or not, he's doing something fictional. And now you're saying God comes along and takes a guy who believes in buried treasures in hills,
guarded by angels.
And the same guy gets to find an actual treasure buried in a hill by a guardian angel.
Well, they might say, well, he was open to the idea.
Conjecture.
See, Bushman would say he was prepared.
Conjecture. See, to be a rational thinker, you have to choose the conclusion that requires the least amount of allowances. And the conclusion that requires the least amount of allowances is that it's all made up. Once you try this, and I don't mean you, obviously, for anybody who's listening who's a believer, try to take the mindset of it's just not true and see how many problems that solves. It solves all of them.
Well, no, it doesn't solve the problem of what happens when I die. It doesn't solve the problem of why is there suffering on the earth?
But there's a bazillion myth stories that answer those questions, and Mormonism is just one of them. So why do you place your trust in Mormonism over all the rest? And it's because you've been inoculated and programmed to do so. Yeah.
Okay, Book of Mormon.
Going back to where you started, Book of Mormon perpetuates the flood story. Jesus mentions it in 3rd Nephi, and also the Book of Mormon mentions the Tower of Babel. But again, that story comes through a different people in a different timeline, and we already know the story is absurd. It promotes a narrative where if you try to hold the numbers of people who died on the hill Cumorah or hill Ramah, same hill, it doesn't make sense. To the point where the church itself and its apologists acknowledge that they no longer want to push a narrative that the hill Cumorah was in New York. We had to create some second hill, conjecture, by the way, to try to figure out hey, we can't really explain hill Cumorah in New York because there's nothing there. So there's some other hill that we don't know where it's exactly at, and that hill's never been explored. And so it's possible that someday we'll find the thing that proves the church is true. But notice how many allowances I need to do to get there. On top of that, you have the Jaredites and the Nephites coming over from ancient Israel, and the scriptures say that they brought their seeds with them to plant crops, and we're also told that they flourished, and yet none of those crops exist today. We have anachronisms of animals that we don't have explanations for, to the point where apologists say that in some places in the Book of Mormon, it must have been a tight translation. And in other places in the Book of Mormon, it must have been a loose translation.
Which animals?
Horses, elephants or woolly mammoths being pertinent to the time period that the church insists that it has to be for that scripture to hold up.
Cattle, goats, sheep.
Yeah. And the apologists come along and go, well, we've solved some of those. So it's reasonable to expect that we'll solve all of them.
Yeah, the number of anachronisms are shrinking over time.
Yeah. Yeah, and then they point at things like chiastic structures.
You didn't answer that defense.
Say that again.
The number of anachronisms, Jim Bennett and other apologists would say, over time, the number of anachronisms is shrinking.
Yeah, I also think that there are anachronisms that we haven't even considered yet. For instance, what I just said, which is that certain crops that were brought over should have made it. There's also anachronisms such as how did Nephi and his small family build a ship to go across the ocean? And John Larson puts out all the flaws with that. And what the argument is that Nephi and the prophets must have been able to do it. There's one other example somewhere in history where somebody built a ship and they did that similar thing. But it also kind of relates to the story of where Brigham Young said that Moroni went all the way out to Manti to bless the temple site. Consider that. The church wants the Book of Mormon to have taken place in Central America. So you have Moroni in Central America, and he needs to, at a minimum, walk to the Hill Cumorah in New York through different climates, different terrains, heavy, dense forestry, trying to find food every day, taking the plates with him.
Carrying 100 and whatever pound plates.
Yeah, even if they're 70-pound plates, good luck. And then what they do is they say there's one other time in history where some person traveled a similar distance under similar conditions, as if giving you one anomaly in 1,000 cases makes it plausible that the church is still true. But your brain has to leap in so many occasions that it becomes statistically absurd. You always used to mention Occam's razor. It becomes statistically absurd to give the benefit of the church in extremes on every issue time after time over hundreds of occasions. That's irrational. It makes much more sense that I not give the allowances on these issues, and on every issue it's in favor of the critic.
What about the racism in the Book of Mormon?
Yeah. The church has done a phenomenal job of pretending like it's disavowed its racism, and still it exists within that book, right? Racism is a big deal when it comes to church theology because it points to whether the prophetic mantle is real or not. In other words, Brigham Young in 1852 implements the policy that people of color can't have priesthood. Whatever reason he does that. Brigham Young's successors and their counselors and the rest of the Quorum of the 12 over the course of 25 years, knew by the power and gift of God, by the Spirit, that they were right and the world was wrong. And so you have to accept that God allowed 15 men, generation after generation, to be clueless at discerning God's word, but somehow they know that coffee is bad. Like, that makes no sense. And if I ask a believing Mormon, I say, come up with, tell me all the great things. Like, you believe that prophets, seers, and revelators are what they claim they are. George Albert Smith, David O. McKay, Harold B. Lee. Tell me what any of those guys did that was so special. And if the church wasn't true, what would that look like? Like, if you're sure the church is true, if it wasn't true, what would it look like? Like, if the church is true, it seems like it would have something to show that it is different than what the world could bring about if it was under the same sort of condition. In other words, if 5 old corporate men were running an entity, could it not come up with the same sorts of things? Don't other churches come up with ideas and plans, and people think that's inspired too? If we have prophets, seers, and revelators, they ought to be better at discerning ethics, at discerning morality, at discerning truth, at discerning error, at discerning God's mind and will better than other folks. And they seem to always be 40 years behind. And that's acknowledged by them because they're the ones that 40 years later admit that their past position was wrong. So going back to what I was originally saying, there are certain things that are absurd in the church. Certain things that you have to go like, that doesn't seem rational. Again, 1 million people dying on the hill Ramah in battle. And there are hundreds of those. There's also hundreds of instances of prophets having to completely change the position when in the former position they were sure that that was God's position anyway. Adam God, for instance. And then you also have hundreds of instances of church leaders, prophets, seers, and revelators being deceptive and dishonest and obfuscating the truth. And what you end up with then is that the integrity and ability of prophets, seers, and revelators doesn't add up. And the truth claims of the church, every single one of them is problematic against the historical context and data. And so you can choose to believe in spite of that, but you have to self-acknowledge if you're aware that you're simply needing to create loopholes to get there. You have to create a Rube Goldberg machine to get there. It's not real.
We could talk about DNA in the Book of Mormon and other things. Do you want to talk about 19th century?
Here's a good one on DNA. Go back. Let's exhume Brigham Young, and let's do a 23andMe test on him and see how much African DNA he has in his genome. In other words, the very men who said that people of color couldn't hold the priesthood almost certainly had the very blood of people of color that they forbid from having the priesthood. David O. McKay would have had African DNA in his blood. That's who he was. He was also part black, because all of us are. It becomes absurd.
Part African, at least.
Yeah. And the whole idea that, you have Lamanites, and the Book of Mormon was written to the Lamanites. There are these folks who came here from ancient Israel. They are the Lamanites. They're the Jaredites. They're the Nephites. The Nephites get killed. Jaredites are gone. But the Lamanites become the Native Americans. And today the church goes, we know the Book of Mormon was written to them, but we're just not going to talk about that anymore because it actually doesn't work. We now self-admit if we lined up 100 Native Americans, we don't have the ability to pinpoint which ones are Lamanites and which ones aren't. Some of them are, but we can't prove that any particular one is. And hence the church itself, who has the Book of Mormon written to Lamanites, can't pinpoint a Lamanite to give the Book of Mormon to.
It's a slight bit more nefarious than that, because they won't talk in general conference or in official publications publicly anymore to broad general audiences about Lamanites. But when they go visit Guatemala or Peru,
they still call them Lamanites.
Or Polynesia.
Amen.
They will refer to them as Lamanites there. Yeah. So there's a double speak, kind of conscious dishonesty that's going on.
It's all double speak. Since 1820, it's been double speak. Yeah. You were told a story about spectacles, and now it's a seer stone, but now we admit it's a seer stone, and now the spectacles are slowly drifting away. Yeah.
Really quickly, Book of Abraham, what's your synopsis?
Yeah. We have the very facsimiles that Joseph Smith imposed were part of the Book of Abraham. We have the very symbols on the Egyptian Book of Grammar that Joseph Smith claimed he was translating into the Book of Abraham. And yet we want to go ignore that. There's some other scroll somewhere somewhere else hidden away, that if we had that scroll, then we'd know that we have the actual Book of Abraham from there. Again, conjecture. All I have to do is go, Joseph said it's these facsimiles, which don't mean what he said they mean. It's these symbols, which don't mean what he said they mean. He says Mormon literally means more good because mon is an Egyptian word that means good and somehow has an English piece on the front end as a contraction on the Reformed Egyptian on the metal plates. And hence Mormon literally means more good. And even Gordon B. Hinckley himself said that's nonsense. Joseph Smith has 5 translation productions, actually 6 when you count the Greek Psalter. He's got the Book of Mormon, Book of Abraham, Book of Moses, the inspired Bible translation, and the Kinderhook plates. And every one of those is translated a different way. Like the apologists go like, this one is a literal ancient text translated by the gift and power of God. This one's a catalyst theory. This one's a secular translation. This one's a plagiarism from Adam Clark's commentary. Like every one of them, like we have to accept that not only is Joseph Smith a translator, he's a translator in 4 or 5 different ways. That's absurd.
What about the recent apologetic that translation wasn't quite the right word.
Yeah.
It's more revelation, less
We only need
translation.
that because the facts don't add up. The only reason you need to change the narrative to create another explanation that is softer and allows the evidence to look more like a fraud and still be a believing theory is because the original theory didn't work.
It wasn't a theory, by the way. The original assertions don't work. Right?
That the book is written by the hand of Abraham, written by his own hand, writing his own writings. And we already know it's not true. Joseph said it's the writings of Abraham written by his own hand. It's not true. The only reason we create a catalyst theory is because a catalyst theory explains all the same evidence that the critic saying it's a fraud explains, but gives it a faithful ending. We wouldn't need a catalyst theory if the Egyptian papyri and the facsimiles equaled what Joseph Smith said they did. We only invent a catalyst theory because what was said it was turned out to be not what it was. That's what I mean by adding conjecture. You create new plausible theories where the critic actually has a more solid explanation, but for which you can explain the exact same evidence and outcome, but you now have a faithful way of doing it, but you needed to give allowances to get there. It's irrational. How many times do you want to be irrational to make Mormonism work? Once maybe, 5 times maybe, hundreds, if not thousands. That's irrational.
Okay, what about, forget all the literalism, scripture's metaphorical, but the church, the true church has been restored, and we've got the priesthood, we've got the authority of God, you know, John the Baptist, Aaronic priesthood, Peter, James, and John, Melchizedek priesthood, ordinances and authority, saving ordinances. What about that?
So I've already been able to explain away all the parts where we have actual historical context that demonstrably shows that the critic has a better argument. And now you want me to still accept the fact that the magical unseen things are still true in some way. Why? Why do I need to believe in the invisible when what's visible already demonstrates that the church isn't true? By moving things from objective data to subjective data, it's a moving of the goalpost. It allows the apologist to pretend like there's some other argument that needs to be made. The primary questions are based on invisible data points. Did Joseph Smith see God the Father? Can't know that. What I can know is that the Book of Abraham, papyri, and facsimiles don't match what Joseph Smith said they did. So if we dismiss all the secondary questions, which are the things that we can actually show in the historical context, and shift the goalpost to the primary questions, which are based on an invisible subjective thinking, that makes zero sense to somebody who already knows on all the objective things that we can debate that it's already demonstrably in favor of the critic. It's absurd. And I wanted Mormonism nothing more than to be true, but I also want the truth, regardless if it hurts, more importantly.
Okay. Any other, you were going to mention like 4 big ones. Did we hit them all, or were there other big ones?
I was essentially saying that there are absurdities that you have to acknowledge you're creating some sort of less than most rational answer for. For instance, Moroni going from South America to Palmyra, and if you believe Brigham Young, going from South America to Manti to Palmyra. That's a long journey for a guy carrying 70 pounds of plates on his back.
With no roads, no cars, no
different
food.
Animals, different climates, different types of food, water, no water, dry, humid.
No trading posts, right?
Nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing but
no tents.
Nothing but
no
different
KOAs,
terrain every step.
No KOAs.
It's absurd.
Yeah. Really quickly, what about polygamy and Joseph Smith? It just his polygamy, but also Joseph Smith's character.
So my favorite story to tell is Lucy Walker. Lucy Walker is 15 years old and her mother dies of some illness, tuberculosis or something. And the dad is really heartbroken. And Joseph Smith comes along and he tells the family, by the way, this is her own writings and her journals. This isn't anti-Mormons making up a story. You're welcome to go ask Brian Hales if this story's true, and he'll tell you yes. Joseph Smith comes to Lucy Walker's dad and says, "Oh, you're going to end up just like your wife. Let me send you on a mission and get you out of here and let you kind of reset yourself." Isn't that convenient? He then tells the dad that he'll take the children into his home, some of them. He'll take 3, 4 of the children into his home, and the rest of them he'll place in other Latter-day Saint homes. So he takes Lucy Walker and her sister, and he takes them into his home and takes care of them as if he is their father. He introduces them to his friends as, "These are my daughters." Then he says that God told him to then change the relationship and to proposition Lucy to enter an intimate relationship with him and become a plural wife of his. And gives Lucy 24 hours to decide. She's 16 years old at the time. She's given 24 hours to decide if she will enter that relationship and take the prophet's word at value. She is 16 years old. She goes home. She thinks about it all night. Doesn't make a decision. She hasn't slept. She comes back to the prophet and says, "I can't. I don't know what to do." He says, "I'll give you 24 more hours. And if you don't choose to do what I ask, then the gates of heaven shall be closed against you." 24 more hours goes by. How much do you think she slept that night? Not at all. Would you have slept? I wouldn't have. She comes back the next day having gotten her answer. Sure, she got her answer. She went 48 hours with no sleep, with tons of pressure on her to make the right decision, to a man that she considered to be her priesthood authority, who was prophet, seer, and revelator, who used abusive, predatory tactics to manipulate her, and for which...
as her foster father or her adopted father, right? I mean, her guardian.
Yeah. So you're changing a parental relationship to an intimate relationship.
Sexual.
And you have to accept that God was perfectly okay with that. You have to accept that God is perfectly okay with 14-year-olds and 15-year-olds in any age, any time of the earth, making decisions to be married to somebody, and that God senses that they're perfectly capable to make such a decision. And you and I both know as fathers, there's no 14-year-old girl on anywhere who knows all the repercussions and understands what she's getting into and has a developed frontal cortex where she can make a decision, a lifelong decision to entangle herself to an older man.
And being coerced into it by someone claiming to be the mouthpiece of God.
With predatory tactics.
Yeah.
If you go and look at what a predator does to convince a child to have sex with them, how they groom them, strangely, coincidentally, with no allowances, it seems like the exact same behaviors that Joseph Smith the prophet practiced. What's more likely? That he's a predator, or that God told him to be abusive and to do that? That God was okay with changing the dynamic of the relationship from parental to romantic? That makes no sense. It's absurd.
Yeah. So many allowances you have to make all of this make sense.
Yeah.
And like you said earlier, like I concluded back in 2001, there's one answer that
solves it all.
makes it all.
Solves it all. And any anomaly to that, like you go like, well, yeah, but what about these things I can't explain? Every single one of those, the concept behind it is also in every other high demand fundamentalist religion. They're also having spiritual experiences. They also know by some knowledge inside of themselves as they've communed with God that their system is true. It's also strange. Mormonism does this thing where it corrupts truth and renames it. It repurposes things. So it takes Jonathan Haidt, who did the recent scholarship on elevation emotion. Elevation emotion, if you go to Wikipedia and look it up, elevation emotion says it's a burning in the chest, AKA burning in the bosom, as Mormonism would say. It's peaceful feelings. It's feeling like the thing you're involved in is some sort of blessing and that humanity is enlightened. Everything about elevation emotion is how Mormons for 200 years have described the Holy Ghost, except that elevation emotion happens to all humans across the globe, and you can be manipulated into feeling it when the actual events taking place are not good or productive. You also have Boyd K. Packer saying that a testimony is gained in the bearing of it, which is just the illusory truth effect. Anytime you repeat something over and over again, you're more likely to believe in it. Also, whoever gets to you first, you're more likely to believe. Hence, the church gets to you when you're a little kid telling you to sing, "Come follow the prophet," right? And you grow older and you believe the church is true. And when someone else comes with evidence contrary, you've already rooted yourself in your belief. It is almost impossible to get you to question that. But it's not just for Mormons. It's also difficult to get Scientologists or Jehovah's Witnesses or Seventh-day Adventists or Islam extremists to question their beliefs when it was rooted in them when they were young as well. Yeah.
All right. Any other matters of, I mean, you could always talk about women and racism
all
and
of it.
LGBT stuff.
There's not one single truth claim upon which the church's being true rest that isn't problematic, and more than that, that the evidence isn't in more favor of the critic than the believer. Every single one. Name one truth claim that is the evidence supports the believer more. Not one. And everybody's free to believe in absurdity. I can't stop someone from believing in a flat earth or not a moon landing or Bigfoot's in their backyard or aliens come down their chimney. People get to believe whatever they want. But this idea that you can choose to believe, when I wrote those emails to you early on, I wrote it to you as if the proposition was neutral. There was just as much evidence on one side as the other. What fell apart was that I realized that was the narrative the church gave me. And that when I actually examined the issues, the scale was so lopsided that I had no choice but to disbelieve, to the point where if I asked you to believe in leprechauns or unicorns, you intuitively acknowledge, intuitively understand that your brain can't get there. You can't believe leprechauns and unicorns because your brain recognizes it's too absurd. For me, Mormonism is the same. It is so absurd, my brain can't make room that it's true. It's so lopsided. It's not close. They let you think it's close. It's not close.
I used to say just 15 years ago, 10 years ago, I would have said there's no smoking gun.
Yeah. And there really
what
is.
do you say to that? There's no smoking gun.
There is 100 of them, and none of them are accepted as the smoking gun.
Yeah, what there is there's massive social pressure against concluding and or vocalizing that a smoking gun exists.
Try to convince a flat earther that there's a smoking gun, that the earth isn't flat. Good luck. Try to convince somebody that thinks the moon landing was fake that the moon landing wasn't faked. Good luck. Anytime there's a crazy idea that some people believe, there's a certain psychological benefit to believing the thing that everyone else doesn't believe. You're in the elite group. Well, guess what? In Mormonism, you're also in the elite group. You're in the true and living church with which the Lord is well pleased. It's going to be really hard to talk somebody who came to that belief in some other way than logic, to use logic and reason to talk them out of it. Yeah.
So Bishop Bill Reel lost his faith and got excommunicated for saying the quiet things out loud.
I'll use RFM's language. Bishop Bill Reel graduated from Mormonism and moved on to a more sure form of reality.
Is that the final word for this episode?
We said a lot today in this one, huh?
Anything else you want to say before we end part 2? And of course, part 3
Deconstruction is terribly hard. It's painful. There were nights that I cried. There were nights I didn't sleep. I stayed up all night reading stuff, trying to find the answers. Deconstructing one's faith is extremely difficult, and it requires that you risk losing relationships. You risk losing your identity. I don't think we should take lightly any person who's going through that process. We ought to be, whether you're a believer or whether you're out of the church, you ought to have compassion for people who do the hard thing and put all of that at risk by deconstructing this thing because truth mattered more to them. Even if you disagree with them, you're a believer and you're sure the church is true. Rather than call them lazy learners, rather than say they're the chaff among the wheat, rather than say they're tares, rather than say that they wanted to sin, do me a favor. Acknowledge that they did the hard thing, even if you disagree with them, that they believed what they were doing was right, and they deconstructed it because they valued truth, even at the expense of losing the entire world around them. You talk about heroes. There's your heroes.
All right. Beautiful. Thank you for parts 1 and 2 today. I think it's going to help a lot of people. What's in store for part 3?
So in part 3, we're going to talk about secular Buddhism. I'm hoping we can talk about drugs a little bit. I'm hoping we can talk about
the theme is reconstruction, right?
Reconstruction.
Building a new, happy, healthy life after the deconstruction.
Yeah.
I don't mean to interrupt you. Keep going.
No. I think there are a lot of things that go into reconstructing something after you've deconstructed harmful myths in your life. And I think there are significant tools that help that. And my hope is that in that conversation, we can talk about what's been beneficial to me as in hopes of modeling, at least on some extent, things that are useful to folks who are in the dark night of the soul, to sense that there's hope on the other side and that they can build a healthy, happy life of well-being and contentment if they're willing to lean in.
So we're going to end by giving them hope? Is that what you're saying?
Amen.
We're not just going to deconstruct and leave them reeling?
I remember sitting in my living room thinking, if I go this next step and leave the church, they might be right. I might drift away into some abyss and lose myself. And what I found in this experience is I figured out and found who I was.
So that's part 3.
Can't wait.
All right. Thanks, Bill Reel. Thanks for a great 2 episodes. We'll come back tomorrow for part 3.
Thank you, John DeLynn.
And everyone, please check out Mormon Discussion Podcast. Check out Mormonism Live Podcast. Check out Radio Free Mormon Podcast. And lots of other cool things.
And I'll add, if you go to mormondiscussionpodcast.org, go up to the very top header. On the very far right, it says helpful resources. If you click that, there are 3 links, and they are to the 3 projects that I was talking about, showing the absurdity of Mormonism, showing the deception of Mormon leaders, and showing the reversals and denouncements of past teachings. And I think that those 3 lists alone make Mormonism statistically impossible to be true in the way that it claims.
This is a list, 3 lists on your website?
Yeah. I crowd shared a project on all 3 of those. I put out the problem and added some of my own answers, and then asked folks to contribute other examples of things that would fit into those lists. And what you find is every list is 50, 70, or 130 long of the issues that you run into in Mormonism that run counter to the church's truth claims.
All right.
Yeah.
We'll put a link to that in the show notes.
Sweet.
If people want to donate to your organization, to your podcasts, to support what you do, how do they donate?
So you can donate to the entity by going to mormondiscussionpodcast.org or mormondiscussions.org. And then at the very top header, there'll be a donate button. Click the donate button, and then that donate screen will have a spot where there's a drop-down window. You can donate to the nonprofit generally, or you can pick your favorite podcast. So if you're a huge fan of Radio Free Mormon and that's where you want your donation to go, you can send $10 or $20, or you can make it a recurring donation of $10 a month or $20 a month, and you can pay more, and we certainly appreciate that. But you can donate there, pick which podcast you give to, or just donate to Mormon Discussion generally. And what that money does is it allows, again, donations to you do the same thing. It allows you to put the time and energy into creating content that continues to help people deconstruct.
And you're doing this full-time now. Radio Free Mormon is doing this full-time. The more full-time people we have doing this work,
the more content you get.
And the more people get the truth.
Right.
Get informed consent.
Yeah.
Right?
Totally.
And tips and tricks to reconstruct.
This thing has hundreds of billions of dollars. And
the church.
All the land that it owns, all the businesses it owns, all the media stations it owns. It's done its fair share to try to control the narrative. Here's your chance to fight back. Here's your chance to have the truth be told.
I like to frame it as to take control of your life and to live the life, the exact life you want to live.
Yeah. But that's done by sharing the truth.
Yeah.
People don't know to deconstruct things, to take it apart, to examine the myths in their world until somebody comes along and goes, hey, just FYI, there's a possibility you weren't exactly told the truth. And if you want the truth, here it is. Do what you want with it. But that's the only way that people wake up and go from believing in a myth to not believing in a myth. Something has to not make sense to them.
There you have it. Support Bill, support Mormon discussion, Mormon discussions, Mormonism Live, Radio Free Mormon, and all the good works done by Bill and his organization.
Love it.
Thanks, everybody. Don't go away. Come right back for part 3. We promise we don't want to just take people's faith away from them, take away their hope, take away their identity. We want to help people become their healthiest, happiest, most enlightened selves.
And there are clear ways to do that.
And that's what part 3 is going to be about. So come on back. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.
All right. See you soon. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us on Mormon Stories. Thanks for your support as well. We'll see you all again soon on another episode. Take care.